Welcome to How to Train Your Alpha, a romantic comedy series where the mistakes are hilarious, the kisses are stolen, and true love is a work in progress. Trust us, you'll want to stick around for this one. From haunted hearts to ancient curses, you'll find stories here that pull you in and don't let go. If you're into tales that twist the real and the unreal, you're in the right place. Nyxen Audiobooks. Hit that subscribe button, and let's dive in. There were a few red flags in the job listing. More than a few, actually, now that Callie thought about it. They weren't exactly waving banners of warning, but they were fluttering ominously in the breeze. Like the part that said, must be comfortable in remote forested areas with limited cell reception. As if comfort had anything to do with it. It sounded less like a perk, and more like a thinly veiled promise of isolation, or the oddly specific note about unusual behavioral traits and group dynamics. What did that even mean? Callie had worked with her fair share of quirky personalities in the corporate world, but unusual behavioral traits suggested something beyond a penchant for interpretive dance at office parties. But Callie's heart was broke. Like borrowing money from your grandma broke, caffeine deprived to the point where her brain felt like it was powered by a hamster on a tiny treadmill, and 3 passive-aggressive voicemails away from being forced to move back in with her yoga-obsessed mother, who believed Mercury retrograde had ruined her last 3 marriages, and that kale smoothies were the answer to all of life's problems. Callie loved her mom, she did, but the thought of enduring another lecture on chakras while surrounded by the aroma of patchouli was enough to make her consider joining the circus. So, when the offer landed in her inbox 6 weeks of on-site consulting for a private client with elevated emotional needs, Callie clicked accept with the speed of someone who hadn't paid rent or her therapy subscription. In 2 months, desperate times call for desperate measures, even if those measures involve potentially encountering a Yeti with anger management issues. Now she was here, in the woods, deep in the woods. The kind of woods that whispered ominous secrets and probably housed creatures that glowed in the dark. Bumping down a dirt road in a Jeep that smelled like expired, pine-scented air freshener and regret, staring at a forest that looked like it had eaten at least 2 tourists and maybe a small village. The trees were so dense they blocked out the sun, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the hood of the Jeep. "Remote," she muttered, slowing to a crawl as the Jeep lurched over a particularly nasty pothole. Right, and this is how every horror movie starts. I'm gonna get murdered by a dude in artisanal flannel and my tombstone will say she died doing exposure therapy. Or worse, she'd become the star of a true crime podcast, forever known as the relationship coach who vanished into the woods. The GPS, bless its silicon heart, gave up halfway through the last turn and blinked out like a suicidal robot. The screen went black, mocking her with its digital indifference. Callie sighed. Technology was overrated. Then she saw it. A massive rusted gate framed by ancient stone pillars, half covered in moss and secrets. The stone was dark and weathered, as if it had witnessed centuries of storms and whispered conversations. Across it, in Gothic lettering straight out of a vampire YA fanfic, was painted, "Gravemore Estate." "Oh, we're subtle today," she muttered, adjusting the rear-view mirror and checking for any telltale signs of demonic possession in her reflection. Not evil lair vibes at all. She pressed the intercom button, already prepping her fake professional voice. It was her, "I'm here to help, not judge your questionable life choices" voice, perfected over years of dealing with emotionally stunted CEOs and social media influencers. The speaker crackled, spitting static like an angry cat. Then a voice deep, rough, with the low gravel of someone who didn't bother with social niceties snapped through. "State your purpose." Callie blinked, momentarily thrown off by the sheer hostility radiating from the speaker. "Hi, yeah, I'm Callie Hart. I'm the relationship coach you hired? Sort of? I think." The email said something about emotional recalibration and aggressive temperament restructuring, which I took to mean your boss needs therapy but refuses to call it that. She added a small, nervous chuckle, which echoed awkwardly in the silence. Deafening silence, thick, pregnant silence that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Callie tapped her fingers on the steering wheel, resisting the urge to make a run for it. Then the gate creaked open, slowly, menacingly, as if it hadn't been opened in a century and was reluctant to break its solitude. "Drive through," the voice growled, the words laced with a clear warning. Do not stray from the road. Well, that's not ominous at all, Callie muttered, shifting into drive. I'm sure this won't end in a forest blood ritual or anything. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of her neck. The estate was massive, sprawling across acres of land like a dark fairy tale come to life, stone and shadow and definitely not ominous architecture. The kind of place where every hallway probably had its own ghost, and the portraits followed you with their eyes. She rolled up in front of a sprawling Gothic manor with ivy strangling the windows like vengeful lovers and stairs that looked like they'd been carved by someone who had serious brooding trauma. Gargoyles perched on the roof, their stone faces contorted in permanent scowls. The whole place screamed, "Turn back now!" As she stepped out of the Jeep, a breeze swept through the trees, cold and sharp as a razor. It smelled of damp earth and something else. Something wild and untamed. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Then the front door opened, and he stepped out. Tall. Intimidatingly tall. Barefoot on the stone steps, as if immune to the cold. Shirtless. Muscles like a marble statue that paid for personal training, ate raw meat for breakfast, and emotionally suppressed everything but rage. Hair dark as midnight, jaw set in a permanent line of disapproval, and eyes so fiercely amber they felt inhuman. They burned with an intensity that made Callie's breath catch in her throat. He looked like he'd stepped out of a myth, a creature of legend. Callie blinked. Oh, okay, so that's a lot of torso. She hoped her voice didn't sound as shaky as she felt. He was distracting. Very distracting. He glared. A glare that could curdle milk at 50 paces. You the welcoming committee? She asked, trying for a light tone. He didn't smile. Didn't blink. Just exuded you should not be here. Energy like a toxic gas. You're the human? He asked, voice gravel and warning, laced with a hint of something she couldn't quite place. Disgust? Curiosity? Last time I checked, she said, grabbing her duffel from the back seat. You must be the one with the intense emotional expression issues. His nostrils flared. You smell wrong. Callie's eyes narrowed. Wow. That's the fastest I've ever been judged by my scent. New record. Seriously. What did that even mean? Wrong how? Too much lavender? Not enough wolfsbane? I don't want you here, he growled, taking a step closer. Yeah, I got that. You're about as welcoming as a tax audit. He took another step forward, chest rising, his muscles flexing with each movement. He was close enough now that she could see the faintest scar above his eyebrow, a white line against his tanned skin. And still, no shirt. Leave. The word was a command, a threat. Already cashed the deposit, she said sweetly, though her heart was starting to pound a little faster. So, unless you want to refund me and explain to your accountant why you're back on the emotional disaster list, I'd sit down and let me do my job. Another step. Another glower. And still, no shirt. It was becoming clear he was making a point. I can't be fixed. His voice was raw, as if he were admitting a deep, painful truth. Good thing I'm not here to fix you, she replied, brushing past him, forcing herself not to flinch. I'm here to evaluate your relationship, readiness, and suggest behavior modification strategies. Or, in normal terms, teach you not to murder people with your eyebrows. Behind him, a man in a sweater vest came rushing down the stairs, looking like he was trying to simultaneously apologize and hyperventilate. He was balding, with a nervous energy that crackled around him like static electricity. Alpha, please? This is the consultant I told you about. Miss Hart. Forgive Alpha Dorian, he's not fond of outsiders. Alpha? Callie raised an eyebrow. I gathered, she said, eyeing Dorian. He's got all the charm of a junkyard dog with unresolved trauma. Dorian snarled, actually snarled, a low, guttural sound that vibrated in the air and stormed back into the house without a word, his bare feet thudding heavily on the stone floor. Callie turned to Sweater Vest. So, where's the nearest exit in case he tries to bite me? I am Edric, the man said hurriedly, gesturing to himself with a trembling hand. Beta of the pack. I'll show you to your room, he said, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. Plural options, I hope? Preferably far away from shirtless McFarrell over there? He didn't answer. Didn't even meet her gaze. Of course he didn't. Edric led her through the manor like a man guiding a bomb through a museum, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting nervously around. The place was gorgeous in that we inherited this haunted castle from a rich, cursed uncle kind of way, towering ceilings, dark wood, chandeliers that probably judged you if you didn't floss. Portraits of stern-faced men and women lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. Callie trailed her fingers along the wall, half expecting it to whisper run. "So, Edric," she said, forcing casualness, "when you said alpha back there, were you being dramatic or is that his actual title?" He hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "It's literal." Callie stopped walking, her eyes widening. "Wait, you're serious? I thought this was just like a retreat for aggressive trust fund bros. Are you telling me this is a werewolf thing?" He gave her an apologetic smile, the kind one reserves for delivering exceptionally bad news. "We were hoping to ease you into it." She stared, her mind struggling to process the information. "You dropped me into a monster mansion in the middle of nowhere with a shirtless, growly guy and didn't lead with werewolf? We didn't want to scare you." "Oh, I'm very calm," she said, gesturing wildly. "Super chill. Love learning. I'm surrounded by literal apex predators after driving into the middle of a horror movie. What's next? Blood oaths. Do I have to howl at the moon to use the bathroom?" Edric looked like he wanted to die, to spontaneously combust into a cloud of sweater fuzz. She waved him off. "Whatever, I've coached worse. There was a guy in Silicon Valley who tried to polydate 3 of his interns and his ex-wife at once. Total emotional werewolf." They reached a wide hallway lined with dusty portraits. Her room was the last door on the left. The brass handle was ice cold beneath her touch. "We placed you at the far end for privacy," Edric offered, his voice strained. "Oh, good. So when I scream in terror, no one will hear me." He gave her a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes, and turned to leave, only to nearly crash into a whirlwind of glitter, leather, and unfiltered chaos. "Edric! Your banana bread is a crime against baking, and I'm pressing charge so." The newcomer skidded to a stop, eyes going wide as they locked on Callie. "Oh, you must be the human." Callie blinked. "I feel like I should be alarmed, but somehow I'm not." The woman stepped forward, curling white blonde hair bouncing, a mischievous grin playing on her lips. Her ripped motorcycle jacket was adorned with patches, and her t-shirt read, "I bite," consensually, in bubblegum pink. She sniffed theatrically, tilting her head to the side. Citrus, sarcasm, and emotional damage. Delicious. Edric sighed, rubbing his temples. "Callie, this is Larka, our combat trainer." Larka winked, a glint of mischief in her bright green eyes. "Also, emotional support chaos goblin, an unofficial welcome committee. Hi." Callie offered a handshake. Larka fist-bumped it instead, her energy infectious. "You're brave," Larka said, eyes twinkling. "Most humans who meet Dorian either run screaming or try to domesticate him with soft piano music and therapy candles." "I'm immune to brooding man syndrome," Callie said dryly. "It's the side effect of having dated a jazz musician with a god complex." Larka cackled, throwing her head back. "I like you, and I fear for my life," Edric muttered, his voice barely audible. Larka threw an arm around Callie's shoulder, squeezing tightly. "Don't worry, sunshine. We don't bite interns. Much." "Noted," Callie said, trying to ignore the way Larka's grip felt unexpectedly strong. "Also, I'm not an intern. I'm the woman who's going to teach your alpha how to talk about feelings without flipping a table." Larka gasped, her eyes widening. "Oh, this is better than that time Edric accidentally proposed to the mailman. I told you, it was a full moon and I was delirious." Edric grumbled, his face turning red. Callie smirked, a spark of excitement flickering within her. "This is going to be fun. Dangerous," Larka corrected, her grin widening. "But also fun." Later that night, Callie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the heavy blanket tucked to her chin and her heart beating entirely too loudly. The room was cold and silent, the only sound the distant howl of the wind. Dorian's voice still echoed in her ears. "You smell wrong." She should have been scared. Rationally, she was scared. She was trapped in a gothic mansion with a pack of werewolves, one of whom wanted her gone. But not just of him. No what scared her was the way he'd looked at her. The intensity in those amber eyes, like she wasn't just a nuisance, like she was a threat. Or worse, like she mattered. And that was a level of emotional complication Callie hadn't signed up for. Not even for a desperately needed paycheck. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep, but the image of Dorian's bare chest and burning gaze was firmly etched in her mind. This was going to be a long 6 weeks. There were exactly 3 things Callie knew for sure. The coffee in the manor was an absolute crime. It tasted like burnt tires and regret, a flavor profile that actively insulted her taste buds and implied a deep-seated animosity towards the concept of morning beverages. She'd choked down half a cup out of sheer desperation, only to immediately regret her life choices. It was the kind of coffee that made you question the nature of reality and the existence of free will. Something howled outside her window at 2 a.m., and she was not okay. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a coyote. It was something else. Something primal and guttural that resonated deep within her bones, a sound that whispered of shadows and ancient hungers. She'd pulled the covers over her head, heart hammering against her ribs, and spent the rest of the night in a state of terrified semi-consciousness, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. Her room had a closet that either led to Narnia or was 100% haunted by Victorian werewolf ghosts. The wood was warped and scarred, the hinges rusted and protested with every movement. The air inside felt colder, heavier than the rest of the room, and there was a faint, lingering scent of wet dog and lavender. She'd peered inside with trepidation, finding only forgotten clothes and cobwebs, but the feeling of being watched lingered, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck that screamed, "Danger!" Proceed at your own risk. She'd barely gotten dressed, pulling on jeans and the aforementioned hoodie in record time, when Edric knocked on her door with the enthusiasm of someone approaching a live grenade. His knuckles rapped softly against the thick oak, as if afraid of waking something sleeping within. "Morning," he said too politely. His smile was strained, his shoulders tense. "Did you sleep well?" The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken caveats. Callie opened the door just enough for him to see the dark bags under her eyes, and the hoodie that said, "Don't touch me until the second coffee." It was a warning, a plea, a declaration of war. "Does anyone sleep well in murder castles?" she croaked, her voice still thick with sleep and lingering dread. Edric hesitated, his gaze flickering past her to the shadowy interior of the room. "You get used to it." He said it with the weary resignation of someone who'd accepted their fate, someone who'd learned to live with the ghosts, literal and metaphorical, that haunted the halls of Gravemore Manor. She stepped into the hallway, holding her travel mug, still half filled with the unholy brew, like a weapon. The hallway itself was dimly lit, lined with portraits of stern-faced individuals who seemed to disapprove of her very existence. "You say that with the voice of a man who's seen some things. We've had challenging guests." He carefully avoided her gaze, focusing on a point somewhere over her shoulder. "Are they all emotionally repressed alpha types? Or just the one who growls like he's allergic to therapy?" She was fishing, trying to gauge the lay of the land, figure out just how deep this supernatural rabbit hole went. "Just the one," Edric said tightly, his jaw clenching. "He's unique." The word hung in the air, laden with understatement. Callie sipped, grimaced. "So is this coffee made from actual dirt or just metaphorical trauma?" "We have a pack member who insists on brewing with mushrooms and bark." He winced as he said it, as if anticipating her reaction. Callie stared at him, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Do I look like I hike for fun, Edric?" He looked genuinely sorry, his face etched with a mixture of apology and mild panic. "I can show you to the kitchen." The kitchen was massive, old, haunted. The air hummed with a strange energy, a mixture of comforting warmth from the hearth and unsettling coldness emanating from the shadowy corners. There was a giant farmhouse table, scarred with age and countless meals, a hearth that looked like someone had cooked a witch in it, and probably had, and a bowl of fruit that may or may not have been decorative since none of it looked real. It was like stepping into a rustic horror movie. Also, someone had written, "Don't touch my almond milk, Larka," on the fridge in red lipstick. The message was scrawled with a manic energy, the letters dripping with a theatrical flair. Before she could ask, Larka burst through the back door wearing a crop top that said, "Alpha this!" A glitter-covered hoodie and combat boots with skull laces. She looked like a rave fairy who was ready for war. "Callie!" she shrieked, arms wide. Her voice was high-pitched and enthusiastic, bouncing off the ancient stone walls. "You lived!" Callie blinked, taken aback by the exuberant greeting. "Why is that a surprise?" "You made it through your first night without running, crying, or getting lightly mauled. That's like a 10-10 on the Gravemore scale." Larka grinned, flashing a row of surprisingly sharp teeth. "Comforting," Callie said dryly. "Truly, I feel so welcome." Larka dropped into a chair with cat-like grace and shoved an entire muffin into her mouth. The muffin disappeared with impressive speed. "So, what's the plan for today, Dr. Feelings?" "Observational assessment," Callie said, pulling out her notepad. "Pack dynamics, baseline emotional temperature. Possibly some icebreakers." Larka beamed, her eyes sparkling with mischievous glee. "Oh my God, are we doing trust falls?" "Please, say yes." "I wasn't going to," Callie said slowly, "but now I feel like I'd be depriving you of joy." "She throws people for fun," Edric said flatly, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Do not encourage her," Callie grinned. "I'm very pro-chaotic team building." "I knew I liked you." Larka mumbled through a second muffin, crumbs clinging to her glittery lips. An hour later, Callie found herself being led through the estate's west wing, which the pack called the Inner Grounds. It was where the pack trained, held meetings, and according to Larka made poor life decisions together. The air here was thick with the scent of pine, leather, and something vaguely feral. At least 8 people were moving around the common area, some sparring with wooden weapons, some reading ancient-looking tomes, one balancing a knife on his finger while listening to opera through headphones. They were a motley crew, a collection of misfits and outcasts who seemed to have found a home within the walls of Gravemore. Everyone stared at Callie like she was a particularly suspicious goat that wandered in from the woods. Their gazes were assessing, wary, and tinged with a hint of curiosity. "She's the human," someone whispered, their voice barely audible but carrying through the otherwise silent room. "I heard she brought a feelings wheel. She smells like sarcasm and lavender." Callie turned to Edric, raising an eyebrow. "Do I need a name tag that says not here to be eaten?" "They're just curious," Edric said, not reassuringly. "We don't usually let outsiders this deep into the estate. And you decided the best way to change that was to drop a mouthy civilian with a psychology degree into the middle of your supernatural drama pit?" Callie gestured around her, taking in the wary faces and the strangely intense atmosphere. He sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Greg said you were..." persistent. "Oh, I'm Greg's legend, sweetheart." She grinned, a flash of amusement in her eyes. "I'm the case," he tells recruits to scare them straight. They reached a wide training room filled with old gym mats, weapons racks, and a faint scent of pine and danger. The air crackled with barely suppressed energy, and standing in the middle of it all, Dorian, shirtless again. His muscles gleamed under the dim light, and his face was set in a perpetual scowl. Callie squinted. "Does he own clothes?" Larka, who had reappeared like a chaos fairy, leaned over, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "We're not complaining." Dorian turned, eyes narrowing the moment he spotted Callie. His gaze was intense, predatory, making her feel like a cornered rabbit. "You're not allowed in this wing." His voice was a low growl laced with warning. "I was invited," Callie said, holding up her clipboard like a shield. "I'm assessing the emotional ecosystem of your pack. This isn't a zoo." "Well, you're not the zookeeper," she shot back, instinctively rising to the challenge. Larka coughed to hide her laugh, clearly enjoying the brewing confrontation. Callie approached slowly, like one would approach a volatile bear. "So, how's your emotional regulation this morning?" He growled, baring his teeth slightly. "I'll take that as not great." Dorian stepped closer, looming over her. "I told Edric, and Edric ignored you because he wants you to stop emotionally imploding on everyone around you," she said, cutting him off. "I'm not here to neuter your alpha energy. I'm here to help you get your shit together before someone gets accidentally decapitated during a disagreement over breakfast." Larka whispered, "She's either gonna die or bondmate him by accident." Edric sighed. "I vote bondmate," Callie turned back to Dorian, meeting his intense gaze without flinching. You don't have to like me, but I'm not going anywhere. So either help me understand how this pack functions, or go back to brooding shirtlessly in the woods. He stared at her for a long, tense moment, his eyes burning into hers. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken hostility and a strange, undeniable undercurrent of something else entirely. Then he turned and walked out without a word, his movements fluid and graceful despite his obvious anger. Is that a yes? She called after him, but he didn't respond. Larka shrugged. That's the Dorian equivalent of a standing ovation. Back in her room, Callie flopped onto the bed and groaned into a pillow. The soft down muffled her words, but couldn't quite contain the frustration simmering within her. This is fine, she told herself. This is fine, just a girl in the woods trying to fix a snarling, emotionally constipated alpha with the help of a feral glitter goblin and a beta who needs anxiety meds. She rolled over and stared at the ceiling, tracing the intricate patterns of the aged plaster. The room felt less oppressive now, perhaps because she had survived another day, perhaps because she was slowly getting used to the strangeness of Gravemoor. And for the first time in a while, she didn't feel like she wanted to leave. Not yet. There was something about this place, something about these people, that had piqued her curiosity, ignited a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, she could help them. Or maybe she was just completely insane. Only time would tell. Breakfast was tense. Not in the dramatic someone about to start a fight kind of way, where silverware clatters and accusations fly. More like everyone was meticulously avoiding eye contact, pretending the world was perfectly normal while sitting next to a ticking alpha-shaped emotional time bomb. The air crackled with unspoken anxieties, a low hum of apprehension resonating through the grand dining room. Callie stood at the far end of the long, mahogany dining table, observing the scene with a practiced eye. Dorian, the aforementioned bomb, was attacking his venison steak with the ferocity of a man settling a personal vendetta. He sawed and stabbed, each movement sharp and deliberate, like the meat owed him money, or perhaps an apology. The rest of the pack, usually a boisterous and lively bunch, looked down at their plates with an almost religious intensity. Forks scraped softly against porcelain, the only sound competing with Dorian's culinary assault course. Edric, the pack's nervous accountant, nervously buttered the same slice of toast for a solid 7 minutes, turning it into a soggy, glistening monument to anxiety. He kept glancing at Dorian, his eyes wide and darting, before quickly refocusing on his toast-buttering marathon. Larka, the resident wildcard, kicked her feet up on the bench, seemingly oblivious to the tension. Or, more likely, she was enjoying it. She chewed loudly on a protein bar labeled Explosive Energy, Wolf Formula, the ripping of the wrapper echoing in the strained silence. Each chomp seemed designed to provoke a subtle rebellion against the suffocating atmosphere. So, Callie said, deciding to rip the bandage off before the tension festered, projecting her voice like she was about to host a TED Talk on disaster prevention. Fun news! Everyone, I'll be hosting a pack-wide emotional literacy session this afternoon. She plastered on a bright, slightly too enthusiastic smile, but no one moved, no one blinked. Dorian looked up, his dark eyes flashing with a dangerous light, like he was about to launch someone across the room. The silence thickened to the consistency of lead. I don't do therapy, he said, his voice a low growl that rumbled through the room. Neither did half my clients before they realized bottling rage makes you die young and ruin birthday parties, Callie replied sweetly, her voice deceptively gentle. Congrats, you're now enrolled in Feelings 101. I'm not interested. He punctuated his words with another violent stab at his venison. And yet, she said, ignoring his aggression and sliding a laminated sheet down the table toward him, you're invited. The sheet skidded to a halt just inches from his plate. He glanced down at the paper, his expression tightening. A color-coded chart with zones of regulation, emoji faces depicting various emotional states, and a large reassuring message that read, "It's okay to be overwhelmed. Alpha." He looked up at her like she'd handed him a live grenade with the pin already pulled. This is an insult. It's a tool, she said, maintaining eye contact. And you'd know that if you opened up instead of snarling like a caveman who stubbed his emotional toe in 1842. Larka snorted into her coffee, narrowly avoiding spraying the table. Edric sighed a low, mournful sound. "Miss Hart? Callie?" she said, her gaze still locked on Dorian. "I only let people call me Miss if they're trying to seduce me or sell me overpriced crystals." Dorian's jaw flexed, a muscle ticking in his temple. He looked like he was struggling to contain something powerful. Callie tilted her head, her expression almost playful. "What? No growl this time?" "I'm disappointed. I don't growl on command." "You're halfway to purring," she said, a teasing glint in her eyes. "I think you like the attention." He stood up so fast his chair scraped across the stone floor with a deafening screech. The entire room froze, every breath held captive. Edric nearly dropped his toast. Larka choked on her protein bar, except Callie, who just took a sip of her terrible coffee and smirked. "I'll see you at 2, group sessions mandatory. Or I start asking personal questions in public." She raised an eyebrow, daring him to challenge her. And then she winked. At 2:00 p.m. Sharp, the pack reluctantly gathered in the training hall, a large, open space usually reserved for physical training. But today, it had been transformed into something else. Mats covered the floor, and stacks of brightly colored beanbags were scattered around, each one labeled with names like Rage, Spot, Cry Zone, and Comfort Nook. Larka, predictably, had been responsible for the labeling. Callie stood at the front, radiating a disconcerting level of enthusiasm. She held a whiteboard marker in one hand and a dangerously enthusiastic smile on her face. "Welcome to Feelings Aren't Fatal," she announced, her voice echoing in the large room. A safe space for emotional accountability, guided vulnerability, and the occasional angry pillow fight. Larka raised her hand immediately, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "When do we throw things?" "That's the second half," Callie said, deflating Larka's excitement slightly. "Today's focus is emotional vocabulary and internal triggers." Theo, the pack's nervous healer, raised a tentative hand, his face etched with worry. "What if your emotional vocabulary is mostly grunting?" "Then, congrats," Callie said, her smile widening. "You're exactly who this was designed for." And then the door opened, creaking slightly on its hinges. Dorian walked in. He avoided looking at anyone, his shoulders stiff, his expression a mask of barely suppressed fury. And he was 1 second away from turning around and walking right back out. "Alpha," Callie said brightly, her voice deliberately cheerful. "Welcome to group therapy." He glared, his eyes narrowed to slits. "I told you, your pack is here," she cut in, her voice firm but gentle. "And they're doing the work. So, unless you're ready to admit they're emotionally stronger than you, have a seat." The challenge hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown down. He stared her down, his gaze intense and unwavering. She stared right back, refusing to flinch, her eyes conveying a quiet determination. Until Larka, unable to bear the suspense any longer, yelled, "Sit, big guy!" and patted a brightly colored beanbag labeled Growl Goblin. To everyone's shock, including Dorian's, he sat. Grudgingly, reluctantly, but he sat. He lowered himself onto the Growl Goblin like it was covered in stinging nettles. Callie, seizing the opportunity, handed him a laminated feelings wheel and a dry erase marker. His face went blank, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What the hell is this?" "It's a guide," she said, like she was explaining complex physics to a kindergartner. "To help you name what you're feeling beyond just pissed off. I am pissed off." He stated it as a fact, a truth as undeniable as gravity. She smiled, unfazed. "Great. Now color it in." The next 30 minutes were chaos. Larka admitted she sometimes threw knives to cope with heartbreak, a revelation that was both shocking and somehow entirely predictable. Theo cried while reading a poem about the healing power of nature, his sobs echoing through the hall. The silent guy in the corner, a hulking werewolf named Boris, who rarely spoke above a whisper, confessed he wanted to learn salsa dancing, a disclosure that triggered a wave of stunned silence followed by enthusiastic support. And Dorian? Dorian didn't speak, didn't move. He sat stiffly on his Growl Goblin, radiating a palpable aura of disapproval. He stared at the feelings wheel like it was a particularly offensive piece of abstract art. He refused to pick up the marker, until Callie, sensing his internal struggle, sat cross-legged in front of him, lowered her voice, and said, You don't have to impress me. He blinked, momentarily caught off guard. I'm not. Good, she said, her voice soft but unwavering, because I'm not impressed by walls. I'm impressed by people who know how to open a damn window. The room was silent, everyone holding their breath, waiting for Dorian's reaction. Callie leaned forward slightly, her eyes searching his. So what is it, Dorian? What's under the anger? Grief? Guilt? Fear? Or is it just easier to push people away than admit you might want something? He didn't answer. His face remained impassive, a carefully constructed fortress, but he didn't walk out, either. He remained seated on the growl goblin, trapped between his defenses and the unexpected pull of Callie's words. And that was enough. Later that night, Callie sat on the balcony overlooking the moonlit forest, sipping whiskey from a chipped mug and wondering what the hell she was doing with her life. The cool night air carried the scent of pine and damp earth. Dorian stepped out of the shadows, silent as always, his presence a sudden, unannounced intrusion. He moved with a predatory grace that belied his inner turmoil. She didn't jump. She had sensed him approaching, didn't look up. She continued to gaze out at the forest, the amber liquid swirling in her mug. You didn't kill anyone today, she said, her voice dry. Progress. He stood beside her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. The only sound was the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. Then said quietly, almost reluctantly, You're not what I expected. She finally looked at him, turning her head to meet his gaze. The moonlight illuminated his features, highlighting the sharp angles of his face and the intensity in his eyes. Neither are you, she replied, her voice soft but honest. Which is kind of the problem. The unspoken question hung in the air. Whose problem was it? Hers? His? Or theirs together? There were better ways to start a morning than being ambushed by Edric before she'd even had coffee. Namely, sleeping in, enjoying a quiet moment with her caffeine, and avoiding any potential emotional crises. But apparently, the universe had other plans. Miss Hart, he said urgently, knocking on her door like there was a fire or worse, an emotional emergency involving someone incapable of handling their feelings. Callie opened it a crack, her hoodie hood up, a ceramic mug clutched in her hands, and her eyes still narrowed with sleep-induced grumpiness. Unless Dorian's grown a second head, Larka's staged a glitter coup or the kitchens have run out of chocolate, I want 5 more minutes and a muffin. She punctuated the statement with a pointed glare. It's Dorian, Edric said, voice grim and lacking any of the playful teasing he usually employed. This was serious. She sipped her coffee, the lukewarm liquid doing little to alleviate her morning misery. Of course it is. It always was. He's sparring. Alone. Callie raised a brow, unimpressed. And this is my problem because... She waited for the inevitable explanation, knowing it would involve something ridiculously dramatic. He's breaking things, Edric muttered, glancing nervously down the hallway. Again. And, well, it's getting a bit out of hand. Callie sighed, mentally preparing herself for the chaos she was about to walk into. She took another long swig of coffee and followed Edric, already regretting her life choices. The training hall was, as suspected, a war zone. Not a strategic, well-planned one, but the kind born of pure, unadulterated frustration. Weapons were scattered haphazardly across the mats, gleaming in the dim morning light. Mats were torn and ripped, evidence of a violent outburst. The punching bag, once a sturdy fixture, was now shredded and dangling from its chain like it had personally offended Dorian's entire lineage. And in the center of it, all shirtless, obviously. Because why wouldn't he bewaz Dorian? Fists were taped, knuckles red and raw. His chest heaved with ragged breaths. His jaw was clenched so tight she was surprised it hadn't shattered into a million pieces. He looked like a pressure cooker about to explode. Callie stood at the edge of the room, taking in the scene with a weary sigh. She crossed her arms, the mug warming her hands. You know, there are less dramatic ways to ask for attention. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence in any way, didn't speak. Just a muscle twitched in his clenched jaw, the only sign he'd even heard her. Then, with a guttural roar, he slammed his fist into a wooden training dummy that exploded into splinters, scattering across the floor like it owed him rent and skipped town. She stepped forward, carefully navigating the debris. Is this because I made you label your feelings with emoji faces? The therapy assignment had struck a nerve. Still nothing. He just stood there, radiating anger like a personal force field. She walked into his eyeline, forcing him to acknowledge her. Fine. Let's play your game. But be warned, I'm good at winning. He finally looked up, his eyes wild-eyed, glowing amber with unrestrained power. He looked dangerous and vaguely terrified. You shouldn't be here. His voice was low, a dangerous rumble. I've been here 3 days, she said, refusing to be intimidated. You're late to the party. Besides, someone has to keep you from demolishing the entire castle. You don't understand, he growled, taking a step toward her. Callie tilted her head, unimpressed. Then help me understand, big guy. Use your words. You know those things you use to communicate complex thoughts and emotions? Try it sometime. I'm losing control. The words were clipped, forced out like they caused him physical pain. That stopped her. Not because it scared her, she'd faced down far worse than a brooding, shirtless alpha, but because for the first time, he looked scared too. Not of her, but of something inside himself. Not her. Of himself. And that, she realized, was a completely different situation. She approached slowly, hands relaxed at her sides to show she wasn't a threat. Then let's make some ground rules. He frowned, confusion momentarily eclipsing the anger in his eyes. What? You need structure, boundaries. A way to feel like you're not about to explode on someone just for breathing too loudly. So, she pointed to the floor between them. Welcome to ground rule 1. No brooding in silence within 10 feet of me. It's bad for my complexion. He blinked, clearly thrown off by her unexpected approach. What? She took a step closer, closing the distance between them. Ground rule 2. If you're upset, say something. Preferably in a complete sentence. Grunting doesn't count. And try to avoid phrases like, destroy all humans, okay? Another step. She was practically in his personal space now, and he hadn't moved. Ground rule 3, she said. Now toe-to-toe with him, tilting her head back to meet his intense gaze. If you're going to pace around shirtless and sweaty, you are legally required to warn me ahead of time, so I can emotionally prepare myself. A girl needs a warning, Dorian. It's only fair. That made something twitch in his jaw. A flicker of amusement, fighting back the darkness. A near smile. Almost. Then he said, low and rough. The words laced with a dangerous edge. What if I break the rules? She smirked, enjoying the shift in the dynamic. Then I give you homework, and I make it introspective. Think journaling, emotional vulnerability exercises, maybe even interpretive dance, focusing on your inner turmoil. I hate you. No, you don't, she said, softening her tone, looking directly into his eyes. You hate how much I see through you, how you can't hide behind the anger and the bravado with me. He didn't deny it, didn't move, didn't breathe. He was a statue, frozen in place, trying to decipher her. Then the silence broke. Why aren't you afraid of me? The question was raw, vulnerable, and completely unexpected. Callie blinked, momentarily taken aback. Because you don't scare me. She said it simply, honestly. You should. His eyes flashed, the amber glow intensifying. You're not a monster, Dorian, she said, voice firm, unwavering. You're just a man who's been taught that feelings make you weak, and you're struggling to reconcile that with the power you possess. He looked at her then, really looked. Like she was both the blade that could cut him open and the bandage that could heal the wound. Like she held the key to understanding something he'd been fighting his entire life. Then he moved. Fast. Callie's back hit the wall with a thud, her breath caught in her chest butt, not from fear. From the sudden closeness, the intensity of his presence, his hands braced on either side of her head, trapping her. Not touching. Just caging. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his skin, the tension rippling under its surface like he was barely holding himself together. You think you're in control here, he growled, his voice a husky whisper that sent shivers down her spine. She smiled slowly, meeting his gaze head-on. I know I am. Silence stretched between them. Thick, electric. The air crackled with unspoken desires and simmering emotions. And then she leaned in, just slightly, closing the distance between their lips. "I'm not here to tame you," she whispered, her voice a soft invitation. "I'm here to teach you what it means to want more than just survival. To crave connection, to embrace vulnerability, to find strength in something other than brute force." He stared at her lips, his eyes dark and hungry. And for one second, dangerous, breathless second, Callie thought he might kiss her, that he might surrender to the pull that had been building between them since she arrived. Instead, he stepped back, just enough to breathe, to regain some semblance of control. "You're playing a game you don't understand." She grinned, unfazed. "Then explain the rules." "I don't have any left." "Good," she said, her eyes sparkling with challenge. "Then we can make new ones." Together, later that night, Callie sat at the long dining table, the silence broken only by the soft scratching of her pen. She was scribbling notes into a new folder she'd labeled, in her most professional-looking handwriting, "Operation Fix the Feral Alpha." Larka dropped into the seat beside her with a dramatic sigh, leaning in conspiratorially. "Sue," she whispered, her eyes wide with anticipation. Did he finally pin you against a wall in a therapy-adjacent way? Callie didn't look up from her notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Define therapy adjacent." "Oh my God, you—" "No," Callie said flatly without a hint of emotion. "We almost emotionally processed through proximity and unresolved sexual tension." "It's very mature," Larka cackled, throwing her head back and laughing. "You're so doomed. You're going to fall for him so hard." Callie didn't answer. Didn't have to. Arguing would only fuel Larka's conviction. Her pulse was still racing slightly, a lingering echo of the encounter in the training hall, and all she could hear in her head was the way he'd said, "You think you're in control?" And the part of her that terrified her most? "I wasn't afraid of losing control at all." In fact, a small, rebellious part of her was eager to see where this dangerous dance would lead. The day announced its arrival with a sharp, insistent whistle. An actual whistle, the kind that belonged on a sports field or a drill sergeant, not in the arsenal of a therapist attempting to coax a pack of supernatural misfits into emotional vulnerability. Callie, however, seemed perfectly at home with the piercing sound. She stood in front of the training field, the morning breeze playfully tossing strands of her hair across her face. A clipboard was clutched in her hand, looking almost comically out of place amidst the rugged landscape and the air thick with latent power. Her expression was far too enthusiastic for someone who, Callie herself would admit, hadn't had her second or even first coffee yet. "All right, misfits and murder pups," she called out, her voice carrying across the field with surprising strength. "Gather round. It's time for mandatory bonding through emotional discomfort." A chorus of groans erupted, a symphony of displeasure echoing from every corner of the field. It seemed that the concept of mandatory fun wasn't universally appreciated. "I don't like bonding," someone muttered from the back. The voice laced with the distinct flavor of reluctant participation. "I don't like mornings," someone else chimed in, equally unimpressed. The atmosphere of collective resistance was momentarily disrupted by Larka's dramatic entrance. She cartwheeled onto the field with acrobatic flair, landing in a flamboyant bow that could rival a seasoned stage performer. "I brought snacks, trauma, and a glitter bomb just in case," she announced, her eyes sparkling with mischievous glee. Callie gave her a fist bump, a gesture of camaraderie and shared understanding. "You're my favorite today." Edric jogged up, slightly out of breath, his clipboard clutched tightly in his hand. He looked at Callie with a mixture of concern and exasperation. "Are we doing this?" "Trust exercises with a pack that's historically bad at sharing anything, let alone feelings." "Exactly," Callie said cheerfully, seemingly unfazed by his skepticism. "Which is why we're starting with my personal favorite, the trust gauntlet." The groans intensified. Then, as if on cue, Dorian arrived late. Because, of course he did. He stood at the edge of the field, a dark silhouette against the rising sun. His arms were crossed, the sleeves of his hoodie casually rolled up to reveal a hint of the powerful musculature beneath. He emanated an aura of brooding intensity, looking like he was seriously considering whether murdering her would count as genuine emotional progress. Callie grinned at him, a flash of white teeth against her tan skin. It was a challenging grin, daring him to object, daring him to resist. He did not grin back. His dark eyes remained fixed on her, unreadable, and simmering with a potent mix of annoyance and something else, something deeper. Callie clapped her hands together, effectively silencing the grumbling and drawing everyone's attention back to her. "Today's exercises," she announced, her voice laced with a playful edge, "will focus on vulnerability, communication, and not mauling your partner. Progress is measured by how little property damage occurs. Do verbal wounds count?" Larka asked, her expression thoughtful. Callie considered the question for a moment, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "Only if they're clever." Exercise 1. Callie clapped her hands again, the sound sharp and decisive. "We're starting with the classic. One person is blindfolded. Their partner guides them through an obstacle course." She held up a simple black blindfold, the fabric soft and unassuming. Everyone stared at her like she was holding a live grenade, the pin about to be pulled. The idea of surrendering control, of placing their trust in another member of their volatile pack, was terrifying. Larka, ever the instigator, grabbed the blindfold first and tossed it to Dorian. "You're up, boss man." Dorian caught it with surprising ease, his movements fluid and graceful despite his obvious reluctance. "Not," he stated flatly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Oh," Callie said, her voice deceptively sweet as she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You'll do it." "With me," Larka gasped dramatically, clutching a hand to her chest. "Oh my gods, this is foreplay." Edric groaned audibly, burying his face in his hands. Dorian stared at her, his eyes narrowed. "You expect me to let you lead Meblind through a field of hazards?" She smiled sweetly, the expression completely at odds with the undercurrent of challenge in her voice. "Yes, it's called therapy, darling. Now put it on." He stared at the blindfold, then at her. His gaze flickered between the two, a silent battle raging within him. Then, shockingly, he yielded. He slowly, deliberately tied the blindfold on, the black fabric obscuring his eyes and plunging him into darkness. Callie stepped directly in front of him, her presence both a comfort and a threat. "Okay, we're starting simple. Take 2 steps forward." He obeyed instantly, his movements graceful and controlled despite his lack of sight. Every step was measured, precise, betraying the intense focus he was exerting. She stepped back, creating a small space between them. "Now, right. There's a log. Your heart beats fast," he said, his voice low and husky, barely a murmur. She blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "Excuse me?" "I can hear it." Callie cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure. "Cool. Creepy." Moving on. They navigated the course, mostly successfully. Callie's instructions were clear and concise, Dorian's movements surprisingly adept. But then, he stumbled slightly on a loose rock, his foot catching awkwardly. Her hand shot out instinctively, catching his arm to steady him. He froze, his body instantly tensing. She froze too, her hand gripping his arm a little too tightly. And suddenly, it wasn't just a trust walk anymore. It was a moment, close, still, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, their senses heightened, acutely aware of each other. "Your hand is shaking," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her skin. "It's cold," she lied, her voice barely audible. "You're lying." Callie dropped his arm like it burned her, recoiling as if she'd touched a live wire. "Finish the course, wolf boy." Exercise 2. Dorian stood with his arms crossed, his expression closed off and unreadable, while Callie climbed onto a low wooden platform. She turned to face the group, a faint blush still lingering on her cheeks. "Okay, so this one's symbolic. You fall backward. Your partner catches you. You learn to let go of control. Alpha Dorian here is going to demonstrate." He didn't move. He remained rooted to the spot, his arms still crossed, his jaw tight. "Don't worry," she said, trying to inject a note of levity into the tense atmosphere. "You can trust me. That's what people say right before betrayal." She smirked, the corner of her mouth tilting upward in a wry smile. "Oh, don't flatter me. I'm not nearly dramatic enough to betray you." And then, without warning, she fell, straight back. Eyes closed, trusting. And for one single second, Dorian's carefully constructed mask of irritation and indifference slipped. his expression shifting from barely concealed annoyance to absolute panic. He caught her. Hard. Hands gripping her waist with a fierce intensity that bordered on possessiveness, her back against his chest, the solid wall of his body bracing her fall. And just like that, Callie forgot what the exercise was even about. The symbolism, the vulnerability, the trust, it all faded into insignificance. She slowly turned her head, her cheek brushing against his shoulder. "You caught me." "I always will," he said, his voice too soft, too vulnerable for anyone else to hear. She blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Okay, that's illegal." "You can't just drop soft declarations like that in the middle of therapy." He set her down gently, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Then stop making me say them." Larka cornered her in the hallway later that afternoon, her eyes wild and manic, a granola bar shaped like a tiny battle axe clutched in her hand. "You felt that too, right?" she asked, her voice a breathless whisper. The sparks, the sexual tension, the spiritual connection with light, romantic enemies, to lovers' potential? Callie stared at her, her mind still reeling from the events on the training field. "Did you eat one of the herbal brownies again?" "Yes," Larka said proudly, taking a large bite of her battle axe-shaped snack. "And I regret nothing." Callie leaned back against the wall and stared up at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. "He caught me." "Yeah," Larka said softly, her tone uncharacteristically serious. "And he didn't let go." Dorian found her sitting by the fire later that evening, a notebook in her lap, the flames casting dancing shadows across her face. He didn't sit, didn't speak. Just hovered, his presence filling the space around her. "You came," she said, her voice soft, almost questioning. "You fell," he replied, his voice low and resonant. "And I felt it in my bones." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and questioning. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Callie's breath hitched in her throat, her pulse quickening. And then he leaned down, just enough for her to feel his voice against her skin, a warm whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "You scare me," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile that hinted at a hidden depth. "Good. That means you're paying attention." It was after midnight when Callie realized she couldn't sleep. Again, which would have been fine if not for the fact that every time she closed her eyes, she kept seeing him, the way he'd caught her earlier, the way his hands hadn't just caught, they'd claimed. A possessive, undeniable claim that sent a shiver down her spine. Not entirely unpleasant, but definitely unsettling. It was a visceral reaction she couldn't ignore, and she was spiraling. Not romantically. At least, that's what she told herself, logically. Trying to dissect the situation, find the root cause of this sudden obsession. Like a healthy adult who'd imprinted on a wolf-shaped trauma bomb with emotional armor and abs carved by divine spite. A stark, almost humorous assessment of Dorian that only amplified the absurdity of her predicament. It was a self-deprecating observation, tinged with reluctant admiration. She threw on her hoodie, the soft fabric, a meager comfort against the turmoil inside. She shoved her notebook under her arm, a desperate attempt to find solace in her writing, a way to untangle the knot of feelings that threatened to consume her. And then she stormed out of her room. The need to escape the suffocating confines of her thoughts was overpowering. She found him at the edge of the woods, alone. As if he belonged there, a creature of the night, separate from the world and its trivialities. Sitting on a fallen log like a brooding fairy tale prince who hated everyone and had killed someone with his bare hands, the image was so vivid, so perfectly Dorian, that it almost stopped her in her tracks. It fueled the dangerous intrigue, the irresistible pull. She almost turned back. Sanity screamed at her to retreat, to protect herself from the inevitable heartbreak. But then he looked up, saw her, really saw her, piercing through her carefully constructed facade, and didn't look away. His gaze was intense, unwavering, and held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Curiosity? Recognition? Callie took a breath, trying to steady her racing pulse. She walked toward him like she wasn't falling headfirst into a terrible idea. Again. This wasn't the first time she'd felt drawn to the flame, even if it meant getting burned. "Can't sleep?" she asked, the question a flimsy attempt to break the tension that crackled in the air. "I don't sleep much." His voice was low and gravelly, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. It sent another shiver down her spine, this one a little more welcome. "Shocker," she muttered, dropping onto the log beside him. The rough bark dug into her jeans, a grounding sensation in the face of the swirling emotions. "Bet you dream in black and white." He didn't smile. His face remained an impassive mask, but she detected a subtle shift, a softening around the edges. But he didn't push her away either. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. They sat in silence for a long moment, the forest humming around them. The sounds of the night were amplified, creating an intimate and almost ethereal atmosphere. "You're loud," he said finally, breaking the stillness with his blunt observation. "In what way?" she asked, tilting her head, genuinely curious about his perception of her. "Your energy, your scent, your thoughts, you buzz. Constantly." It was an unusual description, but strangely accurate. He saw her, even the parts she tried to hide. "I'll take that as a compliment." She couldn't help the playful tone that crept into her voice. It wasn't. He was unyielding, refusing to give her an inch. "Then you're welcome for the personality I bring to this haunted emotional meat mansion you call a home." The jab was intended to lighten the mood, to diffuse the intensity that threatened to overwhelm her. His lips twitched, just a hint of amusement, barely perceptible, almost a smile, a fleeting glimpse of the person beneath the hardened exterior, almost. It was enough to encourage her. She glanced at him, her gaze lingering a moment longer than necessary. "Why do you do it?" "Do what?" He knew exactly what she was asking, but he made her say it anyway. Push people away. Pretend you're stone when you're boiling under the surface. She wanted to understand him, to break through the walls he'd erected around himself. He looked at her, and for once, his eyes weren't hard. The steeliness was gone, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. They were tired. The weight of his past, the burden he carried, was etched into his very being. "I've lost control before." The words were spoken softly, almost a confession. Her voice softened. And people got hurt. The implication was clear. He blamed himself. Callie hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Then maybe it's not about control." He frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What else is there?" "Trust," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Instinct, letting someone else hold the weight when it gets too heavy. She was offering him a lifeline, a way out of the darkness. His jaw clenched. The idea of relying on someone else was agonizing. "That's dangerous. So is isolation," she countered, refusing to back down. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, closing the distance between them. "I know people like you, Dorian. People who think that if they just hold everything tight enough, it won't fall apart. But guess what? We all fall apart. The trick is not doing it alone." She was speaking from experience, sharing her vulnerabilities in the hopes of reaching him. He stared at her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. He couldn't understand why she would spend time with him, why she would want to understand him. "I'm not used to this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "To what?" she prompted gently. "Being seen." The admission was raw and unexpected, a glimpse into the depths of his soul. Callie blinked, her heart aching with empathy. "Well, get used to it, big guy." "Because I'm not going anywhere." She meant it. She was determined to stay by his side, no matter how difficult it might be. Then quietly, without looking at her, he asked, "Do you feel it?" Her heart stuttered, the sudden shift in intensity taking her by surprise. "Feel what?" "This. Pull. Between us." Like a rope tightening. He was acknowledging the undeniable connection that had been simmering between them. Callie swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry. "Yeah, I feel it." The admission was both exhilarating and terrifying. Dorian turned to her slowly, his eyes glowing faintly gold in the moonlight. The supernatural element of his being was on full display, adding to the otherworldly atmosphere. His voice dropped, husky and filled with a desperate question. "What do we do about it?" She stared at him, her mind racing, trying to process the intensity of the moment. Then, without thinking, whispered, "We wait. Until it's real. Not instinct. Choice. It was a gamble, a plea for him to choose her, not just be driven by the primal connection between them. He reached out slowly and touched her wrist. Just that, just a brush of fingertips. But she felt it in her soul. A jolt of energy coursed through her entire being, leaving her breathless and wanting more. He pulled back before she could say anything, breaking the spell. "I should go," he said, his voice tight. He was retreating, pulling back into his shell. Callie nodded, trying to regain her composure. "Yeah, same." They both sat there for 5 more minutes, separately together. Neither of them moved. Rooted to the spot by the unspoken connection they couldn't deny, Callie flopped back onto her bed, heart still hammering like she'd run a marathon through a haunted forest of "I'm not catching feelings" denial. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, a chaotic mix of excitement, fear, and longing. She threw a pillow at the ceiling. The small act of defiance, a futile attempt to regain control. "This is fine," she told herself, desperately trying to convince herself of the lie. It's normal to emotionally imprint on a tortured werewolf with rage issues and excellent bone structure. The self-deprecating humor was her defense mechanism, a way to cope with the overwhelming feelings. Outside, the forest howled, the sound echoing her inner turmoil. And deep in her chest, quiet and terrifying, Callie realized she wasn't just in over her head, she was already under. Submerged in a sea of emotions, drawn into Dorian's world. And there was no turning back. Callie had just finished her second cup of non-trauma-flavored tea blend, carefully chosen for its calming properties and complete lack of existential dread when Larka burst into the dining hall like a glitter-scented tornado. The morning light already streaming through the arched windows seemed to amplify her arrival, making her a whirlwind of chaotic energy. "We've got a situation," she sang, songed, making a beeline for the biscuit basket and snagging one with impressive speed. And by situation, I mean incoming trouble with cheekbones, sculpted by the gods, and a superiority complex rivaled only by ancient pharaohs. She punctuated her words with a dramatic flourish, crumbs flying. Callie lowered her mug, the delicate porcelain clinking softly against the table. "Okay," she said, striving for a level tone that belied the sudden spike of adrenaline. "Do I need to bring my laminated conflict resolution chart, the one with the step-by-step guide to de-escalating supernatural squabblesaurus sword? Because honestly, I'm flexible." "Yes," Larka said, nodding enthusiastically, mouth full. "But mostly the chart. Dorian hates when you use logic. It short-circuits his whole brooding alpha thing and drives him feral." She swallowed and added, "More feral than usual anyway." "Everything drives him feral," Callie pointed out dryly. "He gets worked up over misplaced throw pillows." "Exactly. It's part of his charm." "Or, a part." Larka winked, then hastily grabbed another biscuit. "Gotta fuel up for the impending storm, 15 minutes later, Callie stood at the edge of the pack's territory, the damp earth clinging to her boots. Edric, his jaw tight and eyes narrowed, stood beside her. Along with 2 other pack members she only vaguely recognized from therapy circle, a nervous-looking beta named Sarah, and a hulking, silent gamma she thought might be called Ben. The air itself felt thick, charged with an unseen energy. It was tight, humming, off, like a poorly tuned radio, threatening to burst into static. And then he arrived. Tall, lean, blonde. He moved with the effortless grace of a predator, each step deliberate and controlled. He was wearing a tailored coat midnight blue, impeccably cut that screamed "I speak in riddles and low-key murder people for sport," casually, over afternoon tea. His smirk was the kind that made women roll their eyes and privately fantasize, and men start sharpening knives out of sheer, unadulterated envy. He radiated power, privilege, and the distinct aura of someone who considered rules more of a suggestion than an actual guideline. Callie's first thought, as always, when confronted with this particular brand of supernatural male, was, why does every single one of them look like he models for Dangerously Single Quarterly? Is there some kind of supernatural agency that specifically cultivates this aesthetic? Her second thought, which was far more pressing, was, Dorian is going to lose his goddamn mind. "Alpha Theron of the Ashfangs," Edric said tightly, his voice barely a rumble, clearly struggling to maintain a semblance of alpha authority. "State your reason for crossing the border." Theron's eyes, the color of glacial ice, slid straight past Edric, dismissing him as if he were a particularly persistent housefly. Landed on her and lingered. A slow, deliberate perusal that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. It wasn't overtly sexual, not exactly, but it was possessive in a way that raised all sorts of red flags. "Well, well," he said, his voice a smooth, velvety baritone, as intoxicating as it was dangerous. The infamous human. Callie crossed her arms, trying to project an air of nonchalance she didn't feel. The infamous emotional support consultant. "I prefer to be recognized for my professional achievements." He tilted his head, his gaze sharp and assessing. "You don't smell like Pack." "I don't belong to anyone," she said, emphasizing the word anyone. His smile grew wider, revealing a flash of white teeth that somehow managed to look both charming and predatory. Yet, and that was when the air snapped, because from behind them a familiar growl sliced through the trees, a guttural warning that vibrated through the very ground beneath their feet. Dorian. Storming toward them, coat flying behind him like a dark banner, fury radiating off him in palpable waves. He looked every inch the enraged alpha, a primal force barely contained. Theron didn't flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow, as if observing an interesting specimen in a zoo. Callie, however, exhaled like a woman about to witness a supernatural slap fight, bracing herself for the inevitable explosion of testosterone and territorial aggression. "Back away from her," Dorian said, his voice low and dark. A dangerous rumble that promised pain. Theron looked amused, his gaze still fixed on Callie. "Why? She's unmarked, untied, free. I'm simply interested. She's not yours to be interested in." Dorian's voice was laced with a possessiveness that surprised even Callie. "And she's not yours either." Theron's response was laced with a subtle challenge. A muscle ticked in Dorian's jaw, the only visible sign of the barely contained rage simmering beneath his controlled exterior. Callie stepped forward, inserting herself directly between the two alphas before someone sprouted claws and fur started flying. "Hi! Human in the middle of this pissing contest. Can we maybe not turn me into a prize in your alpha-on-alpha ego duel? I'm not a trophy, and I'm not interested in being fought over." Theron glanced at her, his expression shifting from amusement to something approaching genuine interest. "You're sharp." "I'm also armed," she said, patting her clipboard, which she'd been clutching like a lifeline. "With knowledge, trauma training, and a very low tolerance for posturing." Behind her, Larka whispered, "That's my girl." Dorian moved in fast, his movements fluid and predatory. Not attacking, but claiming space. He stood between her and Theron, every inch of him tense, his body a shield. He radiated a protective aura that was both comforting and unsettling. "Leave," he said, his voice a low growl directed at Theron. Theron raised a brow, his eyes flickering between Callie and Dorian, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. Touchy, isn't he? I wonder why. And just like that, with a casual flick of his wrist and a mischievous glint in his eye, she vanished, leaving only the lingering scent of ozone and expensive cologne. They walked back to the manor in silence, the tension in the air as thick as a fog. Dorian hadn't spoken, his face a rigid mask. Hadn't looked at her, until they were halfway to the manor, the imposing stone structure looming in the distance. Then he said, quietly, his voice almost swallowed by the wind, "He wanted you." Callie stopped, her boots crunching on the gravel path. So I didn't like it." The words were clipped, almost grudging. She turned to face him, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You don't own me." "I know." The admission was raw, laced with a vulnerability she rarely saw. "You don't get to growl at me, chase off potential threats, and then vanish every time things get personal." "I'm starting to feel like a damsel in distress in a badly written fantasy novel." He stopped walking, his fists clenching at his sides. "I'm trying not to claim you," he said through clenched teeth, his voice a low growl. "Because if I do, you lose your choice. And I want you to choose." That shut her up. Because it was raw, honest, and real, she stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception, but all she found was a desperate sincerity. "What if I don't want to be protected?" His eyes darkened, the green swirling with a storm of conflicting emotions. "Then I'll stop standing in front of you." Callie stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat radiating off his body. "And if I want to stand with you?" He blinked. Just once. A flicker of surprise crossed his features before he quickly masked it. Then his voice dropped, becoming a low, husky whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "Then I'll burn down everything that threatens you. At your side." Later that night, Callie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the moonlight casting long shadows across the room. Her thoughts weren't calm. They were storming, a chaotic jumble of emotions and unanswered questions. Because today she'd seen Dorian really seen him. Not the alpha, not the scowl, not the dominance, just the man, terrified of wanting her, terrified of making her choice. And in that space between instinct and control, she realized she wasn't afraid of being his. She was afraid of what it would mean to admit she wanted it too. There were moments when Callie questioned her life choices. Moments of profound regret are sprinkled amongst the mundane. Like when she took this job, a decision fueled by desperation and a questionable faith in her abilities. The memory of the interview alone was enough to make her cringe. Or when she let Larka, her best friend and resident chaos agent, convince her to taste something labeled fermented moon sap. The less said about that particular experience, the better. Let's just say it involved a near hallucinatory state and a very unflattering photo that Larka still threatened to release to the pack's social media. But this was peak chaos. The Mount Everest of regrettable decisions. The culmination of questionable judgment and a deep-seated need to stir the pot. She was currently sitting at a candlelit table in the middle of the training room, holding hands with a very confused pack member while half the house watched with varying degrees of amusement, horror, and morbid curiosity. The air was thick with anticipation, like a balloon stretched to its breaking point. Including one very pissed-off alpha standing in the shadows, his presence radiating possessive fury like a tangible force. She could practically feel the heat of his gaze burning into her back. All part of her plan, of course. A meticulously crafted, albeit slightly reckless, ploy to get a reaction. Because if Dorian wanted to play broody, emotionally restrained lone wolf, lurking in the darkness and communicating solely through grunts and glares, fine, Callie was done waiting for him to come to his senses, done tiptoeing around his moods and deciphering his cryptic signals, done feeling like she was the only one putting in any effort. Time to poke the bear, time to unleash the kraken, time to light a fire under his emotionally stunted backside. "All right, class," she said sweetly, her voice deliberately saccharine, gesturing to the small group of pack members seated in a semicircle around the table. She channeled her inner therapist, plastering on a smile that felt both genuine and slightly manic. Today, we're learning about active listening, intentional eye contact, and not treating your potential mate like an enemy combatant. Because apparently, some of us need a refresher course. Larka was already 2 bites into a cinnamon bun the size of her fist and beaming like it was dinner theater, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle. She winked at Callie, a silent, "You go, girl," passing between them. Theoblis, his anxious little heart, sat across from her, cheeks pink and hands shaking slightly. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world, preferably hiding under a rock. "This is a pretend date," she told him gently, squeezing his hand reassuringly. "Just follow the prompts. Think of it as an improv exercise." He nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "You look nice. Good start," she said, internally patting him on the back. "Now, try asking me about something I care about. Something that sparks my interest." "What? Makes you passionate?" he stammered, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. Callie grinned, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Well, I enjoy therapy, hot tea, and emotionally torturing, emotionally constipated alpha types who think growling is a personality. Especially when they have ridiculously chiseled jawlines and brooding eyes." A low growl echoed from the shadows, confirming her suspicions that Dorian was, indeed, listening. And not happy. Larka cackled, nearly choking on her cinnamon bun. "Oh, I think someone's listening! And he sounds thrilled!" Callie leaned in toward Theo and stage whispered, "Ignore the snarling. That's just the sound of progress. He's processing. 10 minutes later, Dorian stepped fully into the room. The air crackled with tension. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. It was as if a storm had just rolled in. Callie could feel the tension spike like the room had tilted on its axis. Every nerve ending in her body stood at attention. He didn't speak. The silence was deafening, didn't move. He remained rooted to the spot, a statue carved from granite and simmering rage. Just watched. His eyes, dark and intense, followed her every move. So she cranked up the volume. Decided to fully commit to the bit. Might as well go down in flames. "Tell me about your dreams," she said to Theo, placing a hand dramatically on his arm. She focused on his face, trying to project an air of sincere interest. Theo panicked, his eyes widening like a deer caught in headlights. I want to open a tea shop. With scones, and maybe a cat cafe?" "Oh, you sweet cinnamon roll," she cooed, squeezing his arm again. "That's the most adorable thing I've ever heard. We need to make this happen." That did it. The final straw, the tipping point. Dorian moved. Fast. So fast she barely registered it. Suddenly, he was right behind her, hand on the back of her chair, towering over her like a predator about to pounce. He was close enough that she could smell the earthy scent of his aftershave and the raw, untamed scent of his wolf. He was growling just loud enough for everyone to feel it in their ribs, a primal warning that vibrated through her bones. Theo practically fell backward off his seat, scrambling away from the table like a startled rabbit. Callie sipped her tea, feigning nonchalance. Problem? Dorian's voice was low and sharp, laced with barely suppressed fury. "And the session? Why?" she asked. "Oh, so innocent," batting her eyelashes. "You jealous?" He didn't answer. Didn't have to. The look in his eyes said yes, and I'm going to murder a man with emotional precision. He looked like he wanted to rip Theo limb from limb and then lock Callie away in a tower where no one could ever look at her again. She stood, pushing her chair back with a screech that echoed through the room, faced him, meeting his gaze head-on. She refused to back down, refused to be intimidated. "Let's get something straight," she said quietly, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "You don't get to claim me with your eyes and then ghost me with your silence. You don't get to send me mixed signals and then act like I'm the confused one. You were letting him," he started, his jaw tight. "I was demonstrating connection," she snapped, cutting him off. "Which, in case you forgot, is the job you brought me here to do. The job you specifically asked me to help you with." Silence hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken words and simmering resentment. Then, so low only she could hear it, a confession whispered from the depths of his soul. "I can't stand the idea of anyone else touching you." She blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by his vulnerability. "Then say something. Use your words, Dorian. It's not that hard." His eyes darkened, the possessive gleam intensifying. "You're mine." She stepped closer, her pulse thudding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Say it like a man, not a wolf. Tell me what you want. You are mine." He punctuated each word with a deliberate intensity, his gaze burning into her, and suddenly, she was against the table, the cool wood pressing against her back. Not touching, not quite. But the air between them crackled with unspoken desire. Not quite, but his presence wrapped around her like fire, consuming her from the inside out. Callie stared up at him, her breath caught in her throat. And dared him to kiss her. Wanted him to kiss her. He needed to kiss her. He didn't. Instead, he growled, a frustrated, guttural sound, stepped back, and stormed out of the training room, leaving a trail of simmering tension in his wake. "Okay," Larka said, throwing popcorn in her mouth, her eyes wide with excitement. "That was the best episode of this reality show so far. 10 out of 10. Would watch again." Callie sat back in her chair, feeling drained and exhilarated in equal measure. Heart racing, adrenaline coursing through her veins, hands shaking, the lingering effects of his proximity, and whispered to herself, a chilling premonition that echoed in the silence. "This man is going to ruin me." Later that night, she found him outside, standing on the edge of the woods, bathed in the soft glow of the moon. Alone. Always alone. He seemed to prefer it that way. "You scared Theo," she said, her voice soft as she approached him. Dorian didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence at first. Good. She folded her arms, leaning against a nearby tree. You can't just growl your way through your feelings, Dorian. It's not an effective communication strategy. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and something she couldn't quite decipher. I don't know how to do this, he said, his voice raw. Wanting, needing. It was easier before. Simpler. Before me? She asked, her heart skipping a beat. He nodded once, a curt, almost imperceptible movement. Good, she said, a small smile playing on her lips. I want you off balance. I want you messy. I want you to feel things you've never felt before. That's how a real connection starts. That's how you build something that lasts. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, then said softly, his voice barely a whisper, I don't want to lose control. She stepped close, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Then share it with me, she said, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. Let me in, Dorian. Let me help you carry the weight. There were signs. Small ones at first, almost easily dismissed as a coincidence. A draft, a trick of the light, a fleeting thought. But they were there, insidious and growing. Like the way Dorian started hovering in doorways, never speaking, never knocking, just existing nearby like some kind of emotionally haunted gargoyle. His presence was a silent pressure, a weight in the air that Callie couldn't quite ignore. He lingered just outside the frame, a shadow observing, his intense gaze making her skin crawl and her pulse quicken in equal measure. Or how every room she entered suddenly smelled like pine, storm wind, and possessive intentions. It wasn't a conscious application of cologne, but rather an essence clinging to the air around her, a primal declaration that whispered of claim and territory. It was intoxicating and unnerving, a scent that clung to her clothes and hair, following her like a persistent echo. But the biggest clue? The one that ripped through the veil of deniability and smacked her in the face with the force of a rogue wave? He started scent-marking her things. Her coffee mug, now imbued with a faint, earthy musk that made her morning caffeine jolt feel inexplicably intimate. Her sweater, the soft, worn fabric subtly permeated with his scent, turning the garment into a wearable comfort that screamed Dorian to her senses. Her pillow. Callie discovered that one at midnight when she face-planted into the very alpha-scented storm cloud formerly known as her bedding. The scent hit her like a physical blow, a concentrated wave of primal masculinity that erased all other smells. She sat bolt upright and screamed, "What in the feral cat in hell?" Larka burst in 2 minutes later, laughing so hard she dropped her throwing knives. The metallic clatter of the knives hitting the floor barely registered over Larka's uncontrollable mirth. "He marked your bed?" "Oh no, you're officially pre-bonded." "Congratulations, it's a disaster marriage." Larka wiped tears from her eyes, clearly relishing Callie's predicament. "I give it a week before he starts leaving you dead squirrels." "I'm gonna light him on fire," Callie shrieked, flinging the pillow like it had personally betrayed her. Feathers exploded in a cloud of discontent as the pillow sailed across the room. Larka, still grinning, handed her a spray bottle labeled Emergency Alpha Repellent in bold, hastily scrawled letters. "It's mostly lemon juice and spite," she said. "Works on some of the interns." "Mostly." She winked. "Might temporarily mask the scent." Don't expect miracles. The next day, fueled by a potent cocktail of fury and lemon-scented spite, Callie tracked Dorian down to the training yard. He was a figure of controlled power, his movements fluid and lethal as he sparred with another guard, the sunlight glinting off his sweat-slicked skin. She hurled the pillow at his chest. "What? Is this?" she demanded, each word clipped and sharp. He didn't blink, didn't even flinch. His expression remained impassive, a mask of serene indifference that only served to infuriate her further. "Your pillow." "Wrong," she snapped, stalking towards him, the discarded sparring partner wisely backing away. "This is your olfactory hostage. Why are you scent-marking my belongings like a musky territorial cat?" He stared, his usually guarded gaze now radiating an intensity that made her knees weak. "It was unintentional. You expect me to believe you just accidentally put your essence all over my personal sleeping surface?" she challenged, crossing her arms, the lemon spray doing little to quell the lingering storm wind scent clinging to the air. "It smelled like you," he said simply, His voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. And I wanted it to smell like me, too. Callie stopped breathing for a full 5 seconds. The simplicity of his words, the raw honesty in his eyes, short-circuited her brain. Then she hissed. You can't just mark things without consent. That's like supernatural manspreading. Dorian tilted his head, his gaze softening slightly. You're upset. Correct, she said, throwing her hands up in exasperation. But you haven't removed the sweater I marked yesterday, he pointed out, a hint of something unreadable in his eyes. Callie looked down at her hoodie, the soft, comfortable hoodie she had consciously chosen to wear despite knowing its perfidious secret. Cursed. Alpha-scented. Betrayal hoodie. That's not the point, she muttered, avoiding his gaze. She cornered Edric later that afternoon, seeking refuge in his cozy office, the scent of Earl Grey, a comforting balm against the storm Dorian carried. I need answers, or sage, or possibly an exorcism, she pleaded, collapsing into a chair with a dramatic sigh. Edric sipped his tea, his expression serene as ever. He's spiraling. Into what? A scented candle convention? She retorted, earning a rare flicker of amusement in Edric's eyes. Imprinting, but he's resisting it. Callie's eye twitched. Okay, well, he's also resisting me sleeping peacefully. So what do I do? You wait, Edric said, his voice maddeningly calm. I hate waiting, she grumbled, hicking at the leg of the table. I know. She left the conversation and immediately went to reorganize the entire armory alphabetically. It was a futile attempt to impose order on the overwhelming chaos of her feelings, her mind a battlefield between logic and instinct. Therapy through chaos. It was marginally effective. 3 days passed. Or perhaps it was 3 weeks. Time had become a blurred and unreliable metric. Dorian got weirder, not meaner, not colder. He wasn't trying to intimidate or distance himself, just more present. Everywhere she went, he was already there. A silent guardian, a watchful protector. Opening doors, his hand brushing against hers. Refilling her tea, his gaze lingered a moment too long. Touching her elbow when she stumbled, his instincts overriding his control. His grip was gentle, but firm, a silent reassurance that he was there, a steady presence in her turbulent world. The worst part? She stopped hating it, started craving it. The subtle brush of his hand, the scent of pine and storm, the intensity of his gaze. It was a dangerous addiction, one she knew she shouldn't indulge, but found herself unable to resist. That night, Callie sat outside on the back steps of the manor, wrapped in the betrayal hoodie she swore she wouldn't wear again, sipping something warm and staring at the stars like they might offer a personality transplant, or at least a useful distraction. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt him, a magnetic pull that tugged at her senses. Always did. You're angry, he said quietly, his voice blending with the gentle night breeze. No, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm confused. There's a difference. He sat beside her, close, but not touching. The small space between them felt like a chasm, a painful reminder of the walls he had erected around himself. She hated how much she wanted him to close the gap, to bridge that distance with a touch, a word, anything. I'm trying, he said, his voice laced with a raw vulnerability that surprised her. Try harder, she whispered, her gaze fixed on the distant stars. Because I'm not just some random girl you accidentally bonded with. I'm me. I fight back. I ask questions. I make charts. His voice was low, rough, a primal growl barely contained. You make me want things I swore I buried. Like what? She asked, her heart pounding in her chest. You. Callie closed her eyes, letting the weight of that single word wash over her, a tidal wave of emotion threatening to drown her. Breathed in the weight of that word. Then asked, her voice trembling slightly, what scares you more, wanting me or needing me? He didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions and buried fears, but his hand brushed hers on the step, and didn't move. The contact was fleeting, hesitant, but electrifying, a spark that ignited a fire within her. Callie lay awake, tangled in blankets and the lingering scent of storm, wind, and pine, her thoughts racing. Everything in her screamed that this wasn't just a fling, this wasn't a game, this was something far more profound, far more dangerous. This was real, and real was terrifying, especially when your heart was tangled in instinct and the eyes of a wolf who looked at you like you were the only thing holding him together. The full moon rose like a judgment, a silver coin in the inky sky, not a comforting glow, but a stark, accusing light that laid bare every shadow and secret. It was relentless, watching, a silent promise of inevitable change, a ticking clock counting down to something primal and untamed. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation, a low hum that resonated deep in the bones. The entire estate pulsed with a kind of quiet panic. Not the frantic, screaming kind, but the insidious dread that settled in the marrow, the feeling that one's carefully constructed reality was about to shatter. It was the instinctual fear of creatures who knew control was a fragile facade, about to rip like paper before the raw power of nature. Servants rushed through the halls, their hushed voices echoing the rising tension. The scent of beeswax and lemon polish, usually comforting, now felt suffocating. Callie stood at the edge of the manor's long hall, her arms crossed, feeling the cool marble beneath her bare feet. She watched as pack members, usually so composed and confident, moved with a frantic energy. They locked doors with unnecessary force, bracing windows against an intangible threat, whispering ancient rituals under their breath, their faces etched with worry. The metallic tang of fear hung heavy in the air. She hadn't seen Dorian all day. Usually, he found a way to steal a glance, a touch, a lingering look that made her heart skip. His absence was a gaping hole in the day, a void that amplified the encroaching dread, and that, more than anything, told her how bad it was. If Dorian, with all his strength and control, was retreating, then something truly significant was about to unfold. Is this like werewolf PMS? She asked Larka, trying to inject a sliver of levity into the suffocating atmosphere. Her anxiety was a tightly wound spring, threatening to snap. Larka, usually so quick with a sarcastic retort, was all business. She loaded tranquilizer darts into a velvet-lined case, her movements precise and efficient. The click of metal on metal was sharp in the silence. It's like PMS, but instead of crying and chocolate, you get violence and heat-driven dominance struggles. Increased aggression, territoriality. Think caged animals fighting for scraps. So, PMS, but feral. Callie shivered. Despite the rising temperature in the hall, basically, Larka snapped the case shut. But with fangs? Edric joined them, his face pale and drawn, his usually impeccable hair slightly disheveled. He looked exhausted, like he'd been wrestling with something far bigger than himself. Dorian quarantined himself. North Wing. He doesn't want anyone near him. He gave strict orders. Callie's stomach turned, a cold knot tightening with each word. A wave of protectiveness washed over her, a fierce desire to be near him. So you're all just letting him suffer alone? Her voice was sharper than she intended, laced with disbelief and anger. Edric sighed, running a hand through his hair. He's trying to protect you, Callie, from himself. By hiding? By not breaking? By trying to maintain what little control he has left? If he thought he could manage this around you, he would. She stared at Edric, reading the genuine concern in his eyes. But concern wasn't enough. Yeah, that's not going to work for me. She turned and headed toward the north wing before anyone could tell her no. The north wing was dark. Stone walls absorbed the moonlight filtering through the narrow windows, creating long, ominous shadows. The air was thick with dust and disuse, a stark contrast to the well-maintained opulence of the rest of the manor. It was silent, oppressive. Callie stepped into the hallway like it might bite her, her senses on high alert. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle from within the walls, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her veins. And then, a growl. Not a dog's playful rumble, but something ancient and untamed. Low, primal, half-human, it vibrated against her ribs, a physical manifestation of the beast within. It was a sound that promised pain and promised hunger. "Dorian?" she called, her voice softer than usual, almost a plea. The sound seemed to get lost in the oppressive silence of the hallway. "It's me." No response. Only the echo of the growl resonated in her memory. She pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and froze. He was shirtless, barefoot, sweating, his skin glistening in the dim light. He was pacing like a beast caged inside his skin, each step filled with restless energy. His muscles were coiled tight, his veins prominent. His hands shook, trembling with the force of the struggle within. His jaw clenched and unclenched, teeth grinding together, and his eyes glowing, golden, feral. The human warmth she knew so well was gone, replaced by something wild and predatory. "Get out!" he rasped, his voice strained and guttural, barely recognizable. The scent of ozone and sweat filled the air, sharp and acrid. "No!" She stood her ground, her heart pounding against her ribs, but her gaze unwavering. "You don't understand!" He turned away, struggling for control. "Then explain it to me." She needed to understand, needed to know what she was facing, what he was battling. He spun toward her, shaking his breath, coming in ragged gasps. "I can't think around you. I can't breathe. The wolf wants to claim, touch, bite. It's taking over. Every instinct is screaming at me to take you, to possess you. I can't fight it for long if you're here." She stepped closer, drawn to him despite the danger she sensed. "Then let me anchor you. Let me be something to hold on to. Callie!" He reached out, his hand hovering in the air as if afraid to touch her. She placed her hand gently on his chest, feeling the frantic beat of his heart beneath her palm. The heat radiating from his skin was intense. He flinched, a sharp, involuntary movement, but didn't pull away. He closed his eyes, fighting for control. "I'm not scared of you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You're not the danger, the isolation is. You're suffering alone, and that's only making it worse." His breathing slowed, just barely, but his hands gripped her hips like he was drowning, his fingers digging into her skin. He held her as if afraid that if he released her, he would cease to exist. "You smell like mine," he breathed, his voice thick with primal need. The words were possessive, instinctive. "And you keep scent marking my damn toothbrush so it's mutual." She tried to inject some humor into the situation, but her voice trembled slightly. He barked a laugh that cracked into a snarl, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. The wolf was close to the surface. Callie didn't flinch. Instead, she reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp angles of his cheekbones, brushed her fingers through his hair, feeling the coarse strands against her skin, watched his eyes flutter half wolf, half man, a battle raging within their depths. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice a soothing balm. "You're not alone. I'm here. I want to mark you." The confession was raw and desperate. Her heart slammed in her chest, a wave of heat washing over her. "Then do it!" It was a challenge, a surrender, a plea. "No." She blinked, confused. "Why not?" "Because if I claim you now like this, it's instinct, not a choice. And I don't want you tied to me unless every part of you wants it back. I don't want to force you with the wolf." He looked away, ashamed. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Then she whispered, "You're so much better than you think you are." He dropped to his knees, his strength finally giving way to exhaustion. Collapsed against her, burying his face in her abdomen, wrapped his arms around her waist and held on like she was the only thing tethering him to reality, the only thing keeping the wolf at bay. And Callie held him right back, her arms tight around his broad shoulders, offering comfort, support, and unwavering loyalty. They stayed like that for hours. The moon climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the room, breath sinking, a slow, steady rhythm that calmed the storm within. Heartbeats steady, a counterpoint to the frantic pulse of the wolf. Until finally, the tension eased from his body, the rigid muscles relaxing. The glow faded from his eyes, the golden fire dimming to a soft amber, and for the first time in years, he slept, his body limp and heavy against her. Callie woke up, curled beside him on the rug, the rough fibers scratching against her skin. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, painting stripes across the floor. He was still holding her, his arms wrapped around her waist in a possessive embrace. Still breathing softly against her collarbone, his breath warm and steady. And when he opened his eyes, there was no rage. No feral glint, just quiet awe, a flicker of vulnerability in their depths. "You stayed," he said, his voice hoarse with sleep. "Of course I did." She couldn't imagine being anywhere else. "You calmed the wolf." He seemed surprised. almost disbelieving. "Yeah," she whispered, tracing the curve of his jaw with her fingertips. "And maybe I calmed the man too." Back in the hallway, the atmosphere was lighter and the tension dissipated. Larka was waiting with coffee and a knowing smirk. "So, how was your moon date?" she asked, handing Callie a steaming mug. Callie took the mug, inhaling the rich aroma. Feral, vulnerable, hot. She smiled, remembering the intensity of the night. Larka fanned herself. "Ugh, I love love." Callie didn't respond, lost in her thoughts. She was still feeling his breath on her skin, the weight of his body against hers. Still hearing his voice in her chest, the raw vulnerability of his confession. And for the first time since arriving, she didn't feel like the outsider, the girl from the wrong side of the tracks. She felt at home, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Callie woke up to coffee and complete silence, which, considering she lived in a sprawling mansion teeming with growly, supernatural creatures, was deeply suspicious, too suspicious. The usual morning cacophony of shifting furniture, muffled roars, and Larka's questionable singing was conspicuously absent. It was unnerving. She wandered down the long, echoing hall in her oversized hoodie, fuzzy socks adorned with cartoon sloths, and yesterday's eyeliner still clinging stubbornly to her waterline, doing its best to look intentional. She followed the tantalizing scent of caffeine, a beacon in the unsettling quiet, mixed with the underlying, almost palpable tension that usually preceded some kind of, chaos. When she hit the grand dining room, a room usually buzzing with wolfish energy and half-eaten breakfast remains, everyone stopped talking, every single pack member. From the seasoned veterans to the newly shifted, all eyes were fixed on her. Even Larka, the ever-effervescent whirlwind of glitter and inappropriate jokes, was silent, her usual bouncy energy replaced with a strange, almost reverent stillness. Even Edric, the ever-stoic second-in-command, stood ramrod straight, his expression unreadable. Even the guy who hadn't spoken a word in 3 weeks, preferring to communicate exclusively through aggressive eye contact that could curdle milk, was staring, his silence somehow even more intense than usual. Callie blinked, trying to process the scene. Did I die in my sleep? Is this a funeral? Please tell me someone wrote a eulogy with a PowerPoint. I have opinions on font size. Larka's face erupted in her signature grin, breaking the tension like a dam bursting. She clapped her hands together, the sound echoing in the vast room. She's awake. Callie raised an eyebrow, still feeling disoriented and vaguely threatened by the sheer amount of focused werewolf attention. And Edric, ever the formal one, stood up straight and cleared his throat, his voice booming slightly in the silence. He looked like he was about to present a PowerPoint for real, probably about the proper use of commas in werewolf decrees. The Alpha has declared that you are now an official member of the inner pack. Effective immediately. Callie froze, her mind struggling to catch up. All thoughts of coffee and sarcastic commentary evaporated. Wait, what? Larka whooped, jumping up and down. You got initiated, baby! You're officially one of us! What does that even mean? Callie stammered, feeling a strange mix of disbelief and burgeoning warmth spreading through her. Do I get a badge? A cool title? A wolf-scented jacket? I'm partial to leather, but I'm open to suggestions. You get to eat first, said someone from the back. A gruff voice that instantly identified him as a particularly surly shifter named Gus. You get a say in decision-making, another added. This time a woman named Anya, known for her tactical brilliance. You get hugged by Larka once a day. Larka announced with dramatic flair, launching herself at Callie with the force of a small, glitter-covered missile. Callie squeaked as she was tackled into a very aggressive cuddle, Larka's enthusiasm almost suffocating. But I'm not even a wolf, she managed to say between bone-crushing squeezes. Edric smiled, a rare and genuine expression that softened his harsh features. You stayed through the moon. You calmed the Alpha. You chose us. That's more than enough. Callie finally managed to extract herself from Larka's embrace and looked around at the gathered pack. At faces that had once watched her with suspicion, like she was a threat to their tightly knit world. In the room that had once felt like a gilded cage, holding her captive within its opulent walls. And for the first time in her whole life, surrounded by a bizarre, powerful, and fiercely loyal group of werewolves, she realized she'd found her pack. Later that afternoon, the initial excitement having subsided into a comfortable buzz, she sat on the wide, sun-drenched front steps of the manor, a warm mug of chamomile tea clutched in her hands, her hoodie zipped up against the cool breeze, watching the clouds roll in like fluffy white ships on a sapphire sea. She didn't notice Dorian behind her until she heard the gentle clink of porcelain as he set a second cup beside her. The aroma of strong black coffee filled the air. "You don't talk much when you're not grunting," she said without turning, her voice soft against the rustling leaves. "I talk when it matters." His voice was a low rumble, barely audible above the wind. "Oh, good. A man of deep, emotionally bottled mystery. Just what I needed." She took a sip of her tea, trying to ignore the way her heart rate picked up whenever he was near. He sat beside her, the weight of his presence grounding her. Still, heavy. Close. "You did something most of us couldn't," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Look hot in flannel while emotionally dragging an alpha back from the brink of insanity?" She quipped, trying to lighten the mood. He huffed, a small sound that she knew was his version of amusement. "You gave this place hope again." Callie blinked, genuinely surprised. "Okay, wow, that almost sounded like a compliment. Did you pull a muscle saying it?" Dorian turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dappled sunlight. His eyes, usually shielded by a wall of ice, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. "When I asked Edric to bring in help," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I expected a soft-spoken therapist with neutral tones and boundary charts, someone safe." She grinned, a flash of white teeth against her rosy lips. "Instead, you got glitter trauma therapy with a side of sarcasm. Consider yourself upgraded. I got you." The words were simple, but the way he said them, the weight and sincerity behind them, made her chest tighten. She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. The pain etched on his face, the guilt he carried, the strength that held them all together. "Is that a confession?" "No," he said, his voice firm. Then, after a beat of silence, a hint of something more, "It's a promise." She blinked rapidly, unsure how to process the intensity of his gaze, the implication of his words. It was a promise of what she didn't know, but it left a thrilling, unsettling feeling in the pit of her stomach. Larka chose that exact moment, with impeccable timing, to burst out the front door holding a banner she made in approximately 10 minutes with an alarming amount of glitter glue. The banner wobbled precariously in her hands. It read, in lopsided, sparkly letters, "Callie Hart, Pac Baddis Official Emotional Support Human." Callie groaned, burying her face in her hands. "This is why I have trust issues." Larka, oblivious to her embarrassment, struck a dramatic pose, her arms outstretched. "This is also why you have a family now." That night, the pack gathered around the crackling fire pit in the yard, sharing food, swapping stories, and arguing heatedly about whether mind control counted as cheating in board games. The jury was still out. They were a chaotic, mismatched, and undeniably vibrant group. Callie sat comfortably between Edric, who was surprisingly good at roasting marshmallows, and Dorian, whose quiet presence was a comforting anchor beside her. She twirled a marshmallow on a stick, the sugary scent filling the air, warm with belonging. And when Dorian's hand subtly brushed hers, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down her spine, she didn't pull away. Instead, she tentatively, almost shyly, laced their fingers together. He looked at her then, his eyes widening slightly, the ice melting away to reveal a depth of emotion she hadn't thought possible. He looked at her like she'd given him the world, a world he thought he'd lost forever. It started with blood. Not much, just a thin smear across the front steps, sharp and fresh and wrong. A crimson stain against the mundane gray concrete, screaming of violation. Callie stared at it, her heart plummeting into her shoes like a lead weight. The playful anticipation she'd felt a moment before, a silly daydream about Dorian's smile, evaporated, replaced by a cold knot of dread. Then Edric sprinted past her, phone pressed to his ear, eyes wide with a fear that mirrored her own. His usually composed face was a mask of urgency. "Alpha, we've got a breach!" His voice was tight, strained. 10 minutes later, the yard was a war zone. The mundane suburban landscape had been transformed into a staging ground. Pack members moved with practiced efficiency, their faces grim. The scent of threat sharp, musky, other hung thick in the air, a palpable tension that scratched at Callie's throat. It was the smell of the Ashfang pack, a smell that promised violence. Weapons appeared from nowhere. A quiver of arrows leaned against the oak tree. A glint of steel flashed as someone tested the edge of a blade. Larka had paint smeared under her eyes like war stripes, and she was sharpening 2 machetes with a whetstone, her movements fluid and precise. Despite the grim situation, she was singing a pop song under her breath, the upbeat tune a bizarre counterpoint to the atmosphere. "This isn't a drill," she said to Callie, her grin sharp and unsettling. "It's the real ex-boyfriend energy in action." "Wait, what kind of breach?" Callie asked, struggling to catch up. The casual mention of ex-boyfriend energy did little to clarify the situation. Edric looked grim. "Ashfang scouts. They crossed the border. One of ours is injured." His eyes darted around as if expecting another attack. "Where's Dorian?" The question was out of Callie's mouth before she could think it through. Fear for him clenched at her insides. "Already at the border." Edric pointed toward the woods. Callie didn't think. She didn't analyze, didn't hesitate. The primal urge to protect Dorian, to be there for him, overrode everything. She ran. By the time she reached the edge of the woods, the trees were shaking. Not from wind, but from the force of something massive moving within. Growling echoed through the airlow, brutal, bone deep, a sound that vibrated in her chest and sent shivers down her spine. It was the sound of wolves, of anger, of a territorial dispute about to explode. She burst into the clearing just in time to see it, Theron and Dorian, locked in a standoff. 2 figures poised for a fight, the air crackling with barely contained power. Dorian looked wild. His carefully constructed facade of calm had shattered, revealing the raw, untamed creature beneath. Eyes blazing with an incandescent fury, hands clenched into fists, knuckles white, shirt gone. Again at this point, she was 70% sure he burned them on purpose. Every inch of him vibrating with "don't touch what's mine" energy, he was a storm cloud, ready to unleash its fury. Theron looked smug, bleeding from a gash on his cheek, but smug nonetheless. He seemed to relish the chaos he was creating. "Relax," he purred, his voice a silken threat. "Just saying hello to the newest member of your little therapy circle." "She's not part of this," Dorian growled, his voice a low rumble that promised pain. "Oh, but she is," Theron said, turning toward Callie like he had a death wish, his eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto her. "Your scents all over her, your bed, your clothes. Your damn toothbrush." He emphasized the last word with a cruel smile. Callie groaned. "Can we not make my dental hygiene a territory war?" The absurdity of the situation was almost comical, a dark humor that helped her keep her fear at bay. Dorian's snarl cracked through the air like a whip. The sound held a possessiveness that both thrilled and terrified her. "She's not yours to touch," he spat, each word laced with venom. "She's not marked," Theron said, his eyes gleaming with predatory intent. "That means she's fair game." And that? It was a mistake. Because Dorian moved with a speed that defied human perception. 1 second, he was beside her, a protective wall against the threat. Next, he was slamming Theron into a tree with enough force to crack bark and bones. The impact reverberated through the clearing, silencing the birds and sending a shower of leaves cascading down. "She is mine," he roared, the sound raw and primal. The air shook with the force of his declaration. Power rolled out of him like thunder, a wave of pure, unadulterated alpha energy that washed over Callie, leaving her breathless and weak-kneed. And for the first time, Callie saw what he'd been holding back. The immense, almost terrifying strength he kept leashed beneath his controlled exterior. The alpha, unleashed, untamed. Hers. But then, he stopped, right as his claws, elongated and razor-sharp, pressed to Theron's throat, right as blood bloomed beneath his grip, staining Theron's skin a gruesome crimson. Dorian looked up, his eyes blazing with a conflict that mirrored the war raging inside him. Looked at her, and in the middle of everything breathing hard, feral, bleeding, rage, he let go. The control he exerted over himself was almost as terrifying as the raw power he possessed. Theron slumped, gasping for air, and disappeared into the woods like a coward. melting back into the shadows from whence he came. Callie stepped forward, her chest tight with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "You didn't kill him." "I wanted to," Dorian rasped, his voice rough and strained. The admission was both brutal and vulnerable. "But you didn't." She needed him to understand the significance of his choice. His gaze locked with hers, the intensity of his eyes pinning her in place. The storm within him hadn't completely subsided, but she could see a glimmer of something else, hope, and then he said it. Finally, "I love you." Callie froze. The words hung in the air, unexpected and profound. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. His gaze remained locked on hers, unwavering. "I've fought it, buried it, denied it. But I can't anymore." Each word was a confession, a surrender. She blinked, struggling to process the weight of his declaration. "Wow, okay, not how I imagined hearing it. There are usually flowers, maybe a playlist." She tried to inject a little levity into the situation, a nervous attempt to diffuse the intensity. "I don't do playlists." A hint of a smile flickered across his lips, a brief respite from the storm. "Clearly. But that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That felt real." "It is." His voice was firm, resolute. There was no doubt in his eyes. She stared at him, taking in everything. The blood on his hands, a testament to the violence he was capable of. The storm in his eyes reflected the turmoil in his soul. The way he was still shaking, not from rage, but from fear. Fear that he'd lose her now, after finally admitting the truth. So she stepped in, closed the distance between them, bridging the gap of fear and uncertainty, wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him close. "You're an idiot," she whispered, her voice muffled against his skin. "I know." He admitted it without hesitation, a self-awareness that surprised her. "And I love you back." The words were out before she could second-guess them. A rush of truth that had been building within her for weeks. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. He was still wary, afraid of rejection. Then melted. Right there in her arms, the alpha who had just faced down a rival pack member surrendered to her love. Years of restraint, of duty, of carefully constructed walls crumbled around him. For the first time, the alpha let himself fall. Larka handed Callie a protein bar, a flask filled with something amber and potent, and a fresh pair of socks. Her usual cheeky grin was softened with genuine affection. "Congrats on not dying," she said cheerfully, "and also on triggering the full confession. 10 out of 10. Alpha down. Emotions unleashed," rival yeeted. "This week's been productive." Callie just smiled, dazed and overwhelmed by the events of the past hour. "You okay?" Larka asked, bumping her shoulder with her own. Callie nodded. "I think he meant it. The simplest, most profound statement she could make." Larka threw an arm around her. "Oh, honey. He meant it so hard, I'm pretty sure half the forest ovulated." She left at dawn. The world was painted in soft grays and blues, a deceptive tranquility that mirrored the still surface of a lake hiding turbulent depths below. No dramatic goodbyes. No slamming doors, no shattered glass, no operatic pronouncements of eternal love or bitter betrayal, no teary speech. Just the quiet efficiency of someone packing only the essentials, leaving behind all the tangled emotions and unspoken fears. Just a note. Folded once, twice, a small white flag of surrender on the dark wood of the nightstand. It seemed to pulse with the weight of the words it contained. "I need space. Not running. Just scared. Don't come after me. See." The silence in the manor was immediate. A suffocating blanket that settled over every room, every hallway, every creaking floorboard. And total. Not just the absence of sound, but the absence of Callie. The very air seemed thinner, less vibrant. It was like the house knew. Like it had absorbed her energy, her laughter, her chaotic spirit, and now mourned its sudden departure. No sarcasm echoing down the hallways, no witty retorts bouncing off the aged tapestries. No glitter trail from Larka's latest prank war, a testament to Callie's usually meticulous cleanup after being a reluctant accomplice. No coffee brewing, the rich aroma replaced by the sterile scent of dust motes dancing in the morning light. No clipboard lectures, no softly spoken encouragements, no Callie, just the absence of her. An emptiness so profound it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on everything. And in that absence, Dorian unraveled. Slowly, like a tapestry being pulled thread by thread. Not loudly. No raging outbursts, no broken furniture, no displays of his formidable power shattering the windows. Not violently. No outward signs of the storm raging within, just emptied. Like someone had scooped out his insides, leaving behind a hollow shell. Edric found him staring at the front door for the third hour in a row. The morning had bled into the afternoon, the light shifting, the shadows lengthening, but Dorian remained transfixed, his gaze fixed on the point where the gravel path disappeared into the trees. "She's coming back," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper, as if afraid to break the fragile spell of hope clinging to the air. Dorian didn't respond. His eyes were unfocused, lost in some distant landscape of regret and longing. "She said she wasn't running." Edric tried again, a little louder, his hand resting lightly on Dorian's arm. Still nothing. Just the rigid set of his jaw, the tight lines around his mouth. "Then I didn't ask her to stay," Dorian murmured, the words barely audible, like a confession ripped from his soul. "I told her I loved her, but I didn't ask." Edric crouched beside him, his face etched with concern. "You think if you'd asked, she would have said yes?" Dorian shook his head slowly. "I don't know." The honesty in his voice was raw, vulnerable. "Then maybe she needs to figure that out on her own." Edric squeezed his arm gently. Dorian closed his eyes. The pain radiated from him in waves, and whispered, "It hurts." The simple words were a testament to the depth of his feelings, a stark contrast to the stoic facade he usually presented to the world. Callie sat in a cabin deep in the woods, the kind of place where sunlight only dared to peek through, not fully illuminate. She was wrapped in a hoodie that still smelled like him, a comforting scent that simultaneously soothed and tormented her, hands curled around a mug that had gone cold, the lukewarm tea a bitter reminder of her indecision. She hated this, the solitude. The quiet hum of the forest amplified the screaming silence within her. The stillness, every rustle of leaves, every chirp of a bird, was a reminder of the life she had temporarily abandoned. The space. Both the physical distance and the emotional chasm she had created between herself and Dorian. The ache. A constant, dull throbbing in her chest, a palpable manifestation of her conflicted heart. But she needed it, desperately, like a drowning woman gasping for air, because this wasn't a game anymore. No more playful banter, no more adrenaline-fueled adventures, no more witty competitions. This wasn't just a fling, or a job, or a slow-burn disaster that made her feel alive. It was more. This was real. A genuine connection, a deep affection, a terrifying vulnerability she had never experienced before. And real was terrifying, because it came with risks. With the potential for heartbreak. With the possibility of failure. Because what if she wasn't enough? What if her flaws, her insecurities, her past mistakes were too much for him to handle? What if she couldn't handle being tethered to someone whose soul burned like wildfire, someone capable of such intense love, such unwavering loyalty, such breathtaking power? Could she truly stand beside him, or would she be consumed by his light? On the second day, Larka showed up, not with questions or accusations, but with understanding and acceptance. She arrived with a bag of snacks, a motley assortment of sugary delights and salty treats, a ridiculous hat perched jauntily on her head, and zero judgment in her bright green eyes. She didn't ask why Callie left. She didn't pry or demand explanations. She just curled up beside her on the worn wooden porch swing, opened a soda with a satisfying hiss, and said, "I once left the pack for 2 weeks after I accidentally kissed 2 people during a sparring match and couldn't figure out who I liked." Callie blinked, momentarily forgetting her turmoil. "That is both relatable and chaotic," Larka grinned, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Yeah, but I came back. You will too." "How do you know?" Callie asked, a flicker of hope igniting within her. "Because Dorian hasn't come looking," Larka stated it as a simple fact. Callie frowned, confused. "That doesn't make sense." "It does," Larka said, her voice surprisingly serious. "He's giving you what you asked for. That man would burn the sky if you asked. But if you told him not to follow, he won't even breathe in your direction." Callie exhaled, the air heavy with unspoken emotions, her shoulders slumped. "Why does that make it worse?" Because it means he trusts you, Larka said, her gaze unwavering. Even now, even when you've left him heartbroken and confused, he trusts your judgment. He respects your needs. That's love, Callie. And it's rare as hell. That night, Callie pulled out the hoodie she'd stuffed in her pack. It had a tear on the sleeve, a small imperfection that somehow made it more precious. It carried the faint scent of pine and fire and something uniquely hers that had mingled with his. She buried her face in it, the soft fabric scratching against her cheek, and whispered, "I'm such a damn idiot." The words were a mixture of self-reproach and longing. Back at the manor, Dorian stood at the window, a silent sentinel against the encroaching darkness. Still silent, still waiting. Every muscle in his body was tense, every sense on high alert, until a car. The distant rumble of an engine broke the stillness of the night. Headlights, cutting through the darkness, painting the trees in fleeting strokes of light. Dust, billowing up from the gravel road, was a tangible sign of her return. He didn't move, couldn't. Frozen in place by a mixture of hope and fear. Not until he heard the sound of a door slamming shut, the metallic echo reverberating through the night, and a voice muttering, "This was a stupid idea." God, I missed him. I missed everything. He was out the door in seconds, propelled by a force he couldn't control, his heart pounding in his chest like a trapped bird. Callie turned just as he stepped into the light, the moonlight illuminating the raw emotion etched on his face. She stared, drinking in the sight of him. The dark hair, the strong jawline, the intensity in his eyes. He stared, his gaze devouring her. The familiar curves, the unruly hair, the vulnerability she couldn't quite hide. And then, "You came back," he breathed, the words a fragile prayer, a desperate plea. She stepped closer, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. "You didn't chase me. You told me not to." The simple statement held a world of restraint, a testament to his respect for her wishes, even at the cost of his happiness. She looked up at him, her throat tight with emotion, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I needed time. I gave you time." His voice was rough, laced with the pain of separation. "I needed space. I gave you that too. I needed to know that I loved you because I wanted to, not because the bond said I should." This was the core of her fear. The reason for her flight? The truth she had to confront. And the question hung in the air, heavy with anticipation. She smiled, a watery, trembling smile that reached her eyes. I do." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "You're still shaking," he said gently. His voice filled with concern. "I walked away from the best thing that ever happened to me. Give me a minute." The honesty in her voice was disarming. He laughed, actually laughed, a genuine, unrestrained sound that cracked something open in her chest, releasing all the pent-up emotions. Then he pulled her in, his arms wrapping around her with a possessiveness that was both comforting and exhilarating. Held her like she'd never left, like he'd been holding his breath for days. And whispered, "You are my missing piece." The words were a promise, a declaration, a truth that resonated deep within her soul. She buried her face in his neck, inhaling his scent, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. Relief flooded through her, washing away the fear and the doubt, and whispered, "I'm ready now." To face whatever challenges lay ahead, to embrace the love that awaited her, to build a future with the man who held her heart in his hands. She was ready to truly begin. The moment Callie stepped back through the threshold, the relief was visceral. It poured out of her in one giant sigh as she collapsed into Dorian's waiting arms, the embrace feeling like her soul finally exhaling after holding its breath for too long. But sentimentality had to wait. Pulling away, she marched into the dining room, her tone immediately shifting to business. "Okay, which one of you told Larka where I was? Be honest, and no one gets emotionally therapized." A lone hand shot up. "Edric." Callie's eyes narrowed, a playful threat lacing her voice. "I'll be scheduling your surprise vulnerability session next week. Prepare emotionally." Before Edric could even groan, Larka erupted into a whoop of celebration. "She's back, baby!" The tension in the room dissipated, replaced by a surge of warmth and welcome. Callie barely had time to savor her return and a long-awaited cup of tea before Dorian stepped in beside her. He placed a hand gently on her lower back, a silent, possessive gesture that spoke volumes, declaring to the room, She's mine. I trust her, and she chose to come back. But the celebratory atmosphere was fleeting. As sunset bled across the sky, a message arrived, chilling the air and silencing the laughter. It wasn't carried on parchment or whispered on the wind. It was a brutal declaration, burned into the very forest floor, the earth scorched and scarred by massive claw marks. Claim her, or we will. Ashfang. The war room, usually a space of strategy and planning, now pulsed with palpable tension. Edric paced like a caged animal, his usual composure shattered. Larka, her face tight with barely suppressed fury, cleaned her knives with a rhythmic, aggressive hum. The metallic scrape against the stone was a harsh counterpoint to the unspoken dread in the room. Theo was lost in a whirlwind of frantic muttering about magical wards, his voice cracking as he descended into a full-blown breakdown over the moon's influence in the northwest quadrant. Ink stained his fingers as he frantically scribbled on maps, his face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. A N.D. Dorian? Silent. Immobile. A statue carved from granite. His usual vibrant energy extinguished, replaced by a chilling stillness. Until Callie slammed her palm on the table, the sharp crack cutting through the oppressive quiet. You're hesitating. He finally looked at her, meeting her gaze directly. His eyes searched hers, a silent conversation passing between them. You don't want to claim me, she stated, the realization hitting her with painful clarity. Not really. His voice was low, a barely audible rumble that resonated with a deep internal conflict. Not like this. You think it's a trap. He didn't deny it. I know it is. Then let them trap themselves, she snapped, her frustration boiling over. You want this. I want this. Why the hell are we letting them dictate how and when we become something we already are? The whole room stilled, all eyes focused on them. Dorian took a step toward her, his figure looming in the dim light. Then another, each movement deliberate and filled with purpose. He knelt in front of her, not in submission to Ashfang's demand. In devotion to her, Callie Hart? He said quietly, his voice filled with a raw sincerity that resonated deep within her soul. I choose you, not because I have to. Not because of instinct or some primal claim. Because you walked into this pack, shook us all up, and somehow made me believe I could be more than what I was. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat threatening to choke her. The room seemed to fade away, leaving only the intensity of his gaze. He reached up, his calloused hand resting gently against her cheek, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. You want this done your way? Then say the word. I'll wait. I'll fight. I'll do it in front of the moon, or at your pace, or not at all. But they don't get to have you. No one does except you. You own yourself. Callie's heart tried to launch itself out of her chest, pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The vulnerability in his expression was almost too much to bear. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the frantic rhythm of her heart. Then let's do it. Right now. Dorian blinked, momentarily taken aback. What? She grinned, a flash of defiance and pure joy lighting up her face. I'm done waiting, bond me, wolf boy. The ceremony was a stark contrast to the drama that preceded it. It wasn't long, drawn out, or needlessly complicated. It wasn't flashy, filled with pomp and circumstance, gold robes, or ancient rituals passed down through generations. Just the pack gathered beneath the watchful eyes of the ancient trees, the flickering torches casting long, dancing shadows across their faces. They formed a silent circle, their presence a comforting shield against the darkness. And two people standing barefoot in the dirt, grounding themselves in the earth, staring at each other like the world could burn as long as they had this moment. Dorian brushed her hair aside, exposing the curve of her shoulder, the pale skin gleaming in the torchlight. He lowered his head and pressed his lips to her skin, a soft, reverent kiss. Then bit, not hard, not with the brutal force Ashfang threatened, not cruel, not a mark of ownership, but a sign of connection, but permanent. Her breath caught in her throat, a jolt of unexpected sensation rippling through Hiar. The bond ignited like starlight spreading beneath her skin, sharp, powerful, infinite. It was a searing, yet strangely comforting, wave of energy that connected them on a level she couldn't have imagined. She felt him, all of him, the fear that haunted his past, the simmering fire that fueled his protectiveness, the overwhelming love that he had so carefully guarded. And He felt her. The chaos that swirled around her, the unwavering courage that drove her forward, the fierce, untamed heart that beat with a rhythm all its own. Their bond clicked into place like puzzle pieces that had waited 1,000 years to connect, snapping together with a satisfying certainty. It was an undeniable truth, etched into their very beings. And when she opened her eyes, he was already staring, his gaze intense and unwavering, like he'd known she was his long before the bite, before the challenge, before the threat, like he'd recognized a part of himself in her, a missing piece he'd been searching for his whole life. Later, wrapped in thick woven blankets under the vast expanse of the star-studded sky, Callie whispered, "That's it? No glitter? No chanting? No blood moon dance?" Dorian smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling with amusement. "You want glitter?" She sat up, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "I always want glitter." A small pop sounded in the distance, breaking the quiet intimacy of the moment. Then, Larka came running by like a woman possessed, holding a sparkler aloft, yelling at the top of her lungs, "You're married now! Kiss or fight! I don't care!" Callie grinned, shaking her head. "She's emotionally 12. She's our emotionally 12. Dorian chuckled, pulling her back against his side. Callie leaned into Dorian's chest, her hand resting over his heart, feeling its steady, reassuring beat. "You chose me every day," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Until I'm ash in memory." She closed her eyes, savoring the weight of his words, the warmth of his embrace. Smiled. "Then I guess you're stuck with me, Alpha." He kissed her temple, his hand tightening around her. "Exactly where I want to be." They didn't go straight to bed after the bond settled. The air thrummed with unspoken desires, a magnetic pull that tugged them closer with every shared glance. Not because they weren't thinking about it, they were, constantly. The bond had amplified everything, turning every touch into a spark and every thought into a yearning. But because Callie had rules, a carefully constructed list, born of past experiences and a deep-seated need for control, and Dorian, he followed every single one like a sacred oath. He saw them not as restrictions, but as a map to her heart, a guide to earning her trust. Rule 1, no claiming unless she's fully in control of herself and her emotions. He wanted her clear-headed, present, and choosing him with every fiber of her being. Rule 2, no surprises, no taking, only asking. Consent was paramount. He wanted to build a foundation of respect and mutual desire, not dominance and instinct. Rule 3, if he ever calls her little mate during sex, she gets to punch him. Once. Not hard, but enough for satisfaction. It was a playful boundary, a reminder that she wasn't some submissive creature. "I've already broken Rule 3 in my head 10 times, Dorian admitted as he closed the bedroom door behind them, his voice husky with pent-up need. The words hung in the air, thick with playful anticipation. Callie spun on him, eyes flashing. "You even whisper that phrase, and I swear to the moon, I'll emotionally shut you down with a spreadsheet." She meant it. The threat was delivered with a playful edge, but the underlying message was clear: respect her boundaries. He smirked, a flash of white teeth in the dim light. Noted. He was a quick study when it came to he-are. She walked the room like a pacing animal, nervous, buzzing, high on the bond, now settled into her skin like a second heartbeat. It was a heady cocktail of desire and vulnerability. "I've never done this," she admitted, running her fingers over the smooth surface of the dresser, avoiding his gaze. "The whole surrendering thing. You don't have to," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "Not here, not now, not ever if it's not right for you." He crossed the room, stopping just short of touching her, giving her space to breathe, to choose, and that made her melt. The genuine care in his eyes, the selfless offer to prioritize her comfort over his desires, it was a revelation, because he wasn't just some growly alpha now. He wasn't just driven by instinct and possessiveness. He was hers, a partner, a confidant, a love. And he wanted her on her terms. He valued her autonomy, her strength, her very essence. "I want it," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with a newfound certainty. "I want you, but I want to be the one to decide how it goes." The words were a declaration, a reclaiming of control nodded once. Steady, solid, an unwavering promise of support. Then sat on the edge of the bed, a silent invitation. Waiting, patient, giving her the space to choose, to lead. Callie took her time, savoring the moment, the anticipation, the feeling of empowerment, unzipping her hoodie, the soft fabric falling to the floor, pulling off the tank top underneath, baring her skin to his gaze, crawling across the bed, slow, deliberate, each movement a statement of intent. Until she was straddling his lap, the heat of his body radiating through her. "You're letting me lead?" she asked, voice low and husky, a question tinged with disbelief and a thrill of excitement. "I'd follow you into fire," he said, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her heart pound. This is easy. This was about trust, about connection, about giving her what she needed. She kissed him, no hesitation, no soft warm-up. It was a plunge into the depths, a collision of souls. It was messy and hungry, and finally, Dorian kissed like he'd been waiting lifetimes. Like the taste of her was the only thing anchoring him to the world, the only thing that truly mattered. She pulled back, gasping for air, her senses overwhelmed. "You're going to ruin me," she whispered, a mix of fear and desire lacing her voice. "Let me," he whispered back, his breath hot against her ear, a promise of exquisite surrender. They didn't rush it. There was no frantic urgency, no desperate grasping. It wasn't rough. Domination wasn't the goal. It wasn't even gentle in the traditional sense. It wasn't about being delicate, but about being present. It was deep. A merging of two souls, a communion of bodies, hands memorizing each other's curves and angles, the feel of skin on skin, mouths moving like they'd already made vows they hadn't spoken yet, promises etched onto their hearts. She bit his shoulder, a sharp, instinctive act that resonated with the primal connection between them. He groaned her name like a prayer, a desperate plea for more, a testament to the hold she had on him. The bond sang between them, a vibrant, pulsing energy that amplified every touch, every breath, every heartbeat. When they collapsed, hours later, tangled in sweat and sheets and each other's breathing, Callie whispered, "That was more than just instinct. It was something deeper, something sacred." He nodded against her skin, his voice thick with emotion. That was everything. It was the culmination of their journey, the union of their souls. Callie woke up to the smell of real coffee, a rich, aromatic scent that cut through the lingering fog of sleep. Not the mushroom and bark disaster the pack brewed. The swill that passed for coffee was a constant source of misery, real, human. Strong enough to raise the dead, and maybe strong enough to face the new day. She stumbled into the kitchen in Dorian's shirt, the oversized fabric swallowing her frame, her hair a mess, biting back a satisfied grin. The evidence of the previous night was written all over her face. Larka was sitting on the counter, swinging her legs, a knowing glint in her eyes. She slow-clapped, the sound echoing in the otherwise quiet kitchen. Well, well. Look who's glowing like she just got mated by a lightning god. The teasing was expected, but underneath it, Callie could sense genuine happiness. Callie rolled her eyes, trying to suppress the blush creeping up her neck. It was an emotional experience, with side effects, an understatement to say the least. "You walk funny." Larka pointed out, "I will throw a plate at you," replied Callie. Larka held up her hands, feigning surrender, then handed her a muffin. "You're one of us now." The muffin was a peace offering, a symbol of acceptance. "I was one of you before," Callie said, confused. "No," Larka said, her eyes soft for once, the usual mischievousness replaced with a rare moment of sincerity. "Now you're his, and more importantly, he's yours." It was a profound shift in the dynamic, a deepening of the bond that connected them all. Callie took a bite of the muffin. Savoring the sweetness, the comfort, closed her eyes, letting the moment wash over her, smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. Then whispered, "Yeah, he is." He was hers, and she was his, and in that moment, everything felt right. 6 months had painted a new veneer on the ancient bones of the Gravemore estate. It remained a place steeped in history, whispers of the past clinging to its shadowed corners, and, yes, still populated by werewolves grappling with their inner beasts and a distinct aversion to straightforward communication. But something was undeniably different. Gone was the stark, intimidating facade. Now, vibrant flower boxes overflowed with blooms, softening the harsh lines of the stone walls. Welcome mats, emblazoned with snarky declarations like "we bite but only if asked," greeted visitors with a touch of unexpected humor. And dominating the front foyer directly beneath the antique sword Larka stubbornly refused to relinquish was a hand-painted sign, "Welcome to Gravemore Pack Therapy Integration Center." Now with 37% fewer territorial breakdowns. Callie, perched at the edge of a cluttered desk, sipped her tea and squinted at the morning schedule scrawled on her clipboard. The caffeine was a necessary weapon against the day's challenges. 10 a.m. Pack therapy session. Larka promised, somewhat unconvincingly, not to throw anyone through a window. 11 a.m. New recruit intake. Crucial reminder. Do not, under any circumstances, forget the consent forms. Last time was a paperwork nightmare. Noon. Lunch with Dorian, seeking a venue preferably devoid of the pervasive scent of testosterone and raw meat. The door creaked open behind her, a familiar sound that sent a shiver down her spine, not born of fear, but anticipation. No need to turn. She felt him. His presence vibrated in the very air. "Morning, Alpha," she said, her voice laced with a teasing grin. "I thought we agreed on husband," Dorian murmured, his breath warm as he brushed a kiss against the sensitive skin of her neck. "We agreed I'd say that when I felt like it," she countered, tilting her head to give him better access. "And do you?" His voice was a low rumble, a promise of things to come. She turned, leaning back against the desk, the cool wood, a stark contrast to the sudden heat radiating from him. Impulsively, she reached out, grabbing the front of his shirt and tugging him closer. "Yeah," she whispered, her eyes locked on his. "I do." The pack had blossomed, a motley collection of souls drawn to the haven that was Gravemore. Humans, seeking acceptance and understanding. Wolves, wrestling with their primal instincts and the complexities of pack life. A brooding vampire nursing a broken heart and a string of disastrous romantic encounters. Even a self-proclaimed witch who insisted she was merely here for the vibes, though her contributions to the weekly conflict resolution circle were surprisingly insightful. They were united by fractured pasts, shattered trust, and instincts honed by fear. Yet, within the walls of Gravemore, they thrived. They found solace, strength, and a sense of belonging. Dorian led with an unwavering strength, a fierce protectiveness that inspired loyalty and courage. Callie, in turn, led with her heart, her empathy, and unwavering belief in the good within each of them, acting as a balm for their wounded souls. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with. They had created something not just functional, but extraordinary. Unstoppable. At noon, Callie and Dorian sat on the back porch, the midday sun warming their faces as they ate their sandwiches. Below them, Larka was conducting a self-defense class that had, predictably, devolved into a bizarre form of interpretive dance combat. Wolves were spinning, kicking, and leaping enthusiastically, bordering on the absurd. "She's doing it again," Dorian muttered, his brow furrowed in amusement and slight exasperation. "She's expressing herself," Callie said, taking a generous bite of her sandwich. "Let her vibe." "You spoil her," he accused, though his tone was light. "You're just jealous she listens to me," she retorted, a mischievous sparkle in her eyes. "She listens to you because you bribe her with muffins and compliments," he pointed out accurately. "Exactly." "I train people, not wolves," she declared, as if that explained everything. A soft, genuine smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "I trained you," she added, leaning closer with a smug smirk. "Excuse me," he challenged, raising an eyebrow. "I took a grumpy, territorial, emotionally avoidant alpha and turned him into a mostly functional, occasionally shirt-wearing, semi-domesticated partner," she enumerated, ticking off the points on her fingers. "Functional is a stretch," he grumbled, but there was no real heat in his voice. "Semantics," she dismissed, waving her hand airily. Tea hat night, the pack gathered for bonfire night, now a cherished tradition since Callie had insisted on monthly emotional decompression via snacks and collective yelling. The origins of this tradition were based on Callie's extensive research on how to make werewolves less likely to bite and kill everything in sight. Everyone brought something to the communal gathering. Food, of course, in copious amounts. Stories both humorous and poignant. Laughter echoing through the night, chasing away the shadows of the past. Callie brought marshmallows, a seemingly endless supply of them, and a healthy dose of emotional accountability, ensuring everyone participated in the emotional decompression part of the event. Dorian brought his silent, unwavering presence, a beacon of security that allowed the pack to truly relax and be themselves. She sat nestled between his legs, gently braiding a string of fragrant herbs into his dark hair, while Larka, fueled by an impressive amount of sugar, dramatically reenacted their mating ceremony using sock puppets and an astonishingly accurate impression of Dorian's growl. "I still can't believe you stayed," Dorian said quietly, his voice barely a whisper, meant for her ears alone. She looked up at him, her expression soft with love. "I didn't just stay. I built something here with you," he corrected, his hand finding hers and squeezing it gently. He leaned down, his gaze intense and loving. He kissed her, a slow, deep, consuming kiss that spoke volumes. It was a kiss of gratitude, of devotion, of a reverence reserved only for the person who had, quite literally, saved his soul. "I love you," he whispered against her lips, the words raw and unadorned. She grinned against his mouth, her heart overflowing. "I know. You're very trainable." As the moon bathed the estate in its silvery light and the fire crackled merrily, the once wild alpha and the once outsider girl sat surrounded by the pack they had painstakingly crafted into a home. A place of peace, belonging, and unwavering support. No war. The external threats had faded, replaced by the internal struggles they faced together without fear. The constant anxiety that had shadowed their lives had been replaced by a sense of security and hope, just warmth. The comforting embrace of community, of love, of acceptance, and the quiet, unwavering knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever darkness threatened to creep into their haven, they would face it, together. Deleted scene. Callie gives a sex talk to a vampire intern file retrieved from Integration Institute archives labeled. This is why we don't leave Callie unsupervised. The Integration Institute's break room was a chaotic haven of mismatched furniture and half-eaten snacks. Callie, perched on a swivel chair liberated from the IT department, spun to face her Quoria hapless vampire intern named Nigel. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pallid glow on his already unnaturally pale complexion. "So," Callie said, clapping her hands together with unsettling enthusiasm, "you've got questions about sex." Across the room, Dorian, the Institute's resident powerhouse and general voice of reason, paused mid-stride towards the coffee machine. His shoulders slumped. "Callie," she held up a hand, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Nope. Don't alpha me. He came to me. That makes this a teachable moment. Besides, you know I'm right." She smirked. Nigel, if you counted his human years, was 19. 90-something if you didn't. At the moment, he looked like he desperately wished he were intangible, able to turn into mist and float out the cracked window overlooking the Institute grounds. His gaze darted between Callie and the exit like a trapped animal. "My maker," he mumbled, the words barely audible, "said I should seek guidance before attempting to connect with a mortal partner." A faint blush, anachronistic on his undead face, crept up his neck. "Connect," Callie repeated, wheeling her chair closer, a predatory smile playing on her lips. "Wow, that's delicate. Are you trying to have sex or install Wi-Fi? Because I know a guy who can help with the latter." He made a choked, gargling noise, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He gripped the sleeve of his outdated cardigan. Dorian, defeated, muttered, "I'm going to go do anything else. Maybe wrestle a goblin. It'll be less painful." He grabbed his coffee and fled the break room, leaving a trail of exasperation in his wake. "Coward," Callie called after him, but her attention was already back on her student. She turned back, all business, though her eyes still held a spark of amusement. "All right, Fang Boy, lesson 1. Sex is like feeding, but less bitey and ideally more mutual. And with significantly fewer involuntary screams, hopefully." Nigel blinked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What?" "Listen, you're cold, you're pale. You have the vibe of a haunted Victorian painting. That's already working against you." So, if you want to make a mortal feel safe during intimate activities, you need to do 3 things: consent, communication, and snacks. Snacks? Nigel repeated, dumbfounded. He looked down at his hands as if they'd suddenly sprouted claws. People get hungry. Blood sugar crashes are a mood killer. Don't judge. Now, do you know what a clitoris is? He audibly gulped, the sound amplified in the small room. His eyes widened, and he began to sweat, an impressive feat for a vampire. Callie raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. You're immortal. Don't tell me you've walked the earth for 90 years and still think women come from vibes. Because if that's the case, I may need to question my choice of friends. I haven't been with a mortal before, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. The others, they tend to stick to their kind. Oh, sweetie, she said, her tone softening with genuine concern. Do you have any idea what human women expect from a sexual partner these days? We've had the internet. We've evolved. We know things. We have group chats dedicated to this. We have expectations. His hands were gripping the edge of the break room table. His knuckles were white. What do they say in the chats? She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, dead serious. That if you ghost after 2 minutes and no foreplay, your whole lineage deserves to be cursed with eternal wedgies. He looked like he might cry. All the blood seemed to drain further from his face, leaving him looking like a particularly melancholic gargoyle. Callie softened. A little. She hadn't meant to scare him that much. Look, it's not about perfection. It's about listening, paying attention, asking questions, mostly before teeth are involved. And if your partner starts glowing or speaking in tongues, don't panic, that's a good sign. He blinked, his confusion deepening. It is? Well, unless she's possessed. Then call Larka. She knows how to deal with those things. From the doorway, Larka, always cheerful with a penchant for exploding things, grinned, her eyes twinkling with amusement. Nigel's voice was barely audible as he whispered, Do you think I'll be good at it? Callie grinned, a knowing glint in her eyes. Do you want to be good at it? He nodded, his expression earnest. Then you will be. You're nervous. That means you care. And you came to ask for help, which is way more mature than 90% of the hot-blooded idiots in this house. She reached into her bag and tossed him a wrapped chocolate bar, a Snickers. You're not you when you're hungry, am I right? Now go hydrate. Vampires are notoriously dehydrate dread. Read something smutty for research, and don't forget the snacks. And for God's sake, remember to brush your teeth. Vampire breath is not sexy, no matter what the internet says. The intern stood slowly, clutching the chocolate like it was a holy relic. His eyes were wide and filled with a mixture of terror and hope. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Go forth and do weird vampire things responsibly. And remember, safe words are your friends. Dorian leaned in the doorway again, shaking his head. You scarred that poor intern for life. Callie shrugged, completely unrepentant. He'll be fine. I gave him a reading list. And some chocolate. Everyone loves chocolate. You gave him fan fiction. / fic at that. Dorian pinched the bridge of his nose. Exactly. High-quality, plot-driven educational material with explicit descriptions of anatomy. What more could you ask for? Dorian just shook his head, a weary sigh escaping his lips. Remind me to never let you teach again. Too late, she said sweetly, her eyes gleaming. I already scheduled advanced consent and cuddling for Thursday. Bring your pillows. Until next time. Stay curious, stay bravant, never stop listening. That's the end of this tale. But in the world of the supernatural, there's always another shadow waiting. Thank you for staying with me through every twist, turn, and heartbeat. If you enjoyed the ride, there's more waiting for you. Just check out the other audiobooks on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more magic, monsters, and stories that go bump in the night. Until next time, stay curious and brave and never stop listening.